Some of the questions that are swirling at a time where, you know, the jury's still out?
I think there's two things. The campaign probably thought that internally, the Democratic Party would not be airing these grievances out loud, that they would, to Representative Smith's point, just get in line. Two, the president was out campaigning. He sat for an interview. They thought that would be enough. But then clearly after the weekend, they realized this is not going to quell some of these concerns.
Scripted radio interviews? Was that the interview?
Two scripted radio interviews. Well, I can't for sure say they were scripted, but obviously the president, I believe the campaign said, did have notes in front of him, a sit down with ABC, and then he was in Pennsylvania, where our poll shows Trump is leading by 7 points. Biden has to hold the blue wall, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, or it is a very challenging, pretty much zero path back into the White House.
How many people believe that was an off-the-cuff phone interview yesterday on US cable news?
Okay. Why is it phone? We all ask the same question, right? What is it about phoning into a television show? I don't know.
Everyone's asking if this was impromptu. Likely was not. It's interesting that the President of the United States decided to use a phone when there is a slew of cameras outside his door on Pebble Beach. I used to stand in front of one.
I always felt like with Donald Trump, it was a proper impromptu phone interview. I felt like he was consuming cable news that morning and he would just call into the control room and say, put me on. I always felt like that was real. And there was certainly no script because he was all over the place. With Biden yesterday, with the president, it just felt like there was a script in front of him and he was reading from it and he was trying to be fiery. He was trying to come out swinging. How many people believed that? I don't know. Maybe the hosts, certainly the hosts, based on their reaction to it, but I don't know if many others did.
The interesting thing is, and Emery, you mentioned this earlier, is that this is something that's been swirling in the public imagination for a long time. It's just that some of the Democratic leaders are now saying the quiet part out loud. So a lot of this is sort of like, you can split hairs, but it's not changing anyone's view because you've already gotten the impression over so many months of, you know, a lot of gaffes, et cetera. These are some of the issues that people are saying, so we could talk about it. But the jury is already gone for a lot of people who've been watching.
Biden yesterday, I'm getting so frustrated by the elites. This has been showing up for polls for over a year that he is too old. And his own party, Democrats, did not think he'd be the man to serve another 4 years.
I love this term, the elites. I'm sorry. If you've been in politics to 4, 5 decades and you yourself has become a multimillionaire, aren't you an elite now? You're the president of the United States. This idea that you're Scranton Joe, working class, blue collar, give me a break. 40, 50 years in politics, and we're meant to sit here and believe you're not part of the elites, the establishment in Washington.
Well, and even if you do, 3 hours later, he's on the phone to some of those elites saying, thank you so much for supporting me. Please give me your money. I would like to speak to some of these people and wonder how much resonates or whether it's just sort of, yeah, you have to say that so everybody sort of believes that you're on their side.
We'll talk to a donor in about an hour from now. Let's turn a page to this story. It's connected. Former President Donald Trump is preparing to announce his running mate. Trump telling Fox News the vice presidential pick will be named in the coming week, possibly at the Republican National Convention. Here's the lineup. Senators J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, Tim Scott, Governor Doug Burgum are all expected to be on the short list. And based on his comments yesterday, it sounded like he still doesn't know who he's going to pick.
These are also the obvious choices, right? Because they're showing up at the rallies, they're with him at the debate. There are some other names I would say you should throw into this mix. One, former Secretary Ben Carson. His name has been brought up to me a few times. And also, and the Wall Street Journal editorial board continues to bring up his name, and this would be what Terry Haynes has called a unity ticket light. Governor of Virginia, Glenn Youngkin. This also is a man that potentially can help Trump win Virginia. And where did Trump go immediately after the debate? Virginia, and stood next side of him.
Watch this space in the next week or so. Watch this space this morning. Top of the schedule in Washington is actually this. It's NATO leaders looking to reaffirm support for Ukraine. Despite widespread problems at home, President Joe Biden, France's Emmanuel Macron, and Germany's Olaf Scholz all heading to the summit in Washington with domestic distractions. Bloomberg's Piotr Skolomovsky joins us now for more. Piotr, wonderful to catch up with you, sir. Walk us through what's meant to be the priority in Washington, D.C. this morning.
Hi, indeed. So the summit starts today, and what's obviously the 75th anniversary of the NATO, and what the leaders were supposed to come with is the sense of unity. But obviously, what's it's going to be is it's going to be slightly different. What we're talking about is that, at least for the European leaders, they're all, or most of them, are slightly distracted by the fact that Emmanuel Macron is just now emerging from the election, where obviously the cordon sanitaire worked, and the far left, the far right was repelled. They came third. But still, it's a deadlock. We don't know what's going to emerge, what kind of government are we going to have in France in the end. In Germany, Olaf Scholz, obviously, his party didn't do very well in parliamentary elections, in the European parliamentary elections. So the only leader who's coming there with sort of a mandate and strength is Keir Starmer. But still, in the UK, his priorities are social spending, and it's not entirely clear whether and how quickly UK will deliver on the commitments on defense spending. So obviously, that's the picture we're seeing from Europe. And above all this, we also have Viktor Orban, Hungary's prime minister, who's just angered all of the allies and EU leaders as well by first obviously visiting Volodymyr Zelensky last week, but then going to Putin and then going to China to meet Xi without ever consulting anyone in the EU. So he's also coming in. He's part of the NATO crew, Hungary's part of the members of the membership. So that's kind of the picture that we're seeing. But above all this, the focus is obviously on the state of the U.S. politics and what happens to Joe Biden and what happens afterwards.
Yeah,
the election.
I'm really glad you brought up Viktor Orban. We were in Kyiv together when he was visiting Zelensky. He immediately went to Moscow and then to Beijing. How can this NATO group get anything done when it comes to fortifying Ukraine when you have the likes of Viktor Orban basically going against their will and meeting with Putin?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, obviously, they will just continue to carry on. I mean, the question is obviously how much spending that there can come, and there is a certain commitment to spend 40 billion to help Ukraine. What's been very difficult is that's the commitment for the next year. What they haven't achieved, and what's been sort of the goal of the outgoing NATO chief Stoltenberg, was the goal of a commitment for 5 years for 400 billion. So it's obviously Viktor Orban is one of the people who are openly against further aid to Ukraine. He's talking about peace deals, but at the same time, you're not seeing like full commitment from most of the European leaders to kind of commit for years on military spending to Ukraine. He's like the most obviously extreme example of where it's going, and obviously he talks about peace, which at this point it's really difficult to imagine how it's going to happen. So what we're going to get at the end is obviously the question is, as you mentioned, Zelensky said he's hoping to get some kind of a invitation to join NATO. He's not going to get it. What he's going to get is some sort of a commitment that it's irreversible. The path towards NATO membership is irreversible, but there will be conditions attached. So we'll see how it goes.
Piotr Skolomoski, big week, not just for NATO, for the President of the United States. I think Justin Sink of Bloomberg called this the big boy news conference, and now everyone within the administration is calling this a big boy news conference, which sounds kind of odd, but that's taking place on Thursday, right?
The idea is that potentially he won't just take 2 to 4 questions because they have something to prove. Well, he offered up for more journalists in the room to ask more questions, and that potentially can quell some concerns. Does he perform better this Thursday than he did at the debate the previous Thursday 2 weeks ago?
That's a big test coming up later this week. Let's get you an update on stories elsewhere this morning with your Bloomberg brief. It's Danny Berger. Hey, Danny.
Hey, John. Just wanted to revisit that Viktor Orban story. The Hungarian prime minister shocking his European and Western allies, paying recent visits, as Piotr mentioned, to both Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping. EU leaders have sought to distance themselves from Orban's shuttle diplomacy, which they emphasize does not represent the bloc. But their attempts to denounce his visits are complicated by the fact that Hungary has taken over the EU's rotating presidency. Orban now heads to Washington for that NATO summit. BP shares, it's going to check on them, slumping in London this morning, down 4 1/3%. The company warned of weaker oil refining and write-downs. BP sees significantly lower refining margins and says it will take up to $2 billion in impairments in the second quarter. The figure includes charges related to scaling back refining operations in Germany due to high costs and declining fuel demand. The Fed is considering a rule change that could save billions of dollars in capital for the U.S.'s largest 8 banks, according to a Reuters report. The update would impact how the Fed calculates an extra layer of capital it imposes on systematically important banks, known as the GSIB surcharge. The deliberations are reportedly still ongoing, with no final decisions yet made. And that's your Bloomberg Brief. John.
Danny, thank you. More from Danny in about 30 minutes' time. Up next on the program, testing U.S. growth.
Maybe the US can push that narrative, the fiscally driven growth narrative, a bit further, but how far are we going to test it? You only find that point of no return until after you've crossed it. Markets are pricing in on course for a September move.
That conversation up next, live from New York City. You're watching Bloomberg Surveillance.
The names that move markets are on Bloomberg.
How worried are you about the U.S. election? It's for the American people to decide what they want with their politics, with their government, with their future. But obviously, we are all concerned about it because the United States is the largest economy, the largest defense country in the world, and has been a beacon of democracy with all its upside and downside. We cannot interfere with their choice. It's their choice, and that's the beauty of democracy. But we have to be extremely attentive and anticipate, just as we do with inflation. You know, we do scenarios. What if, what if, what if? Then what do we do? Where I sit now in Frankfurt, head of the ECB, I think that we have to be strong as Europeans and not assume that we can rely on whoever our friends are around the world, because these things change over the course of time, as we have seen.
Bloomberg. Context changes everything. It's the world's second largest economy with a growing influence in global affairs. But geopolitical uncertainties, deflationary pressures, and questions about foreign investment linger. Bloomberg, the China Show, brings you the unmatched expertise you need to keep track of breaking news, in-depth market analysis, and the most influential newsmakers in and around China. Bloomberg, the China Show. Weekdays around the world, right here on Bloomberg. Context changes everything. Get your fixed income fix. Watch Bloomberg Real Yield every Friday, right here on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Live from New York City, welcome to the program. Your S&P 500 positive by 0.25%. In the bond market, yields drifting higher by a single basis point, 429.20. And the surveillance this morning, testing U.S. growth.
Maybe the US can push that narrative, the fiscally driven growth narrative, a bit further, but how far are we going to test it? You only find that point of no return until after you've crossed it. Markets are pricing in on course for a September move. Steeper curve, but in a gradual, normalized, steady manner, or is it going to be something less so? I think that's what markets need to watch out for.
So here's the latest this morning. Fed Chair Jay Powell giving his semi-annual testimony on Capitol Hill at 10 a.m. Eastern. Traders will be looking for clues about Fed policy in the second half of the year. Cassie Barrow of JP Morgan saying this: the Fed's motivation to cut may need to shift from fine-tuning policy to offset falling inflation to easing policy to protect a weakening labor market. If core CPI comes in at expectations, we would expect the Fed to start signaling for September. Cassie joins us now for more. Cassie, good morning. I'm always happy when people frame things this way because not all rate cuts are created equally. What kind of rate cuts are you expecting? The kind of bearish ones when you respond to labor market cracks, or the bullish ones where it's just about fine-tuning off the back of disinflation?
I think we're really teetering on the edge of those two options, and it's a little uncertain, where we're going to land. But I do think for now, we're still talking about rate cuts that are preemptive. It was, at first, when we started the year, rate cuts that were preemptive because inflation was falling, and that was going to give the Fed scope to fine-tune. Now, the rate cut narrative is shifting a little bit to we may need to protect the labor market, but again, that's still a preemptive action to keep the expansion going rather than one where we're worried about an immediate risk of recession.
We started this program this morning with a quote from Chairman Powell in Sintra, Portugal last week. I'll share it with the audience again. Because the US economy is strong and the labor force is strong, we have the ability to take our time and get this right. How much time do you think he actually has to get this right?
I think he does have some time, and that's because not everything is pointing to things turning very quickly. So even though we've seen this rise in the unemployment rate, even though the breadth of job growth has narrowed fairly significantly, we're still seeing an economy that's operating basically around trend. So you look at the Atlanta Fed GDP tracker right now, it's at 1.5%. And this is generally still an okay environment for most companies that our analysts talk to. So when you look in the investment grade, the high yield universe, I tell them growth is around trend right now. What does that mean for your companies? They say, that's still a fine environment for us.
Which is the reason why some people are saying, actually, he should wait. I mean, there still are those people who are expecting, and I'm thinking of Torsten Slok, no rate cuts this year, because if you look at 35 record highs on the S&P 500, you look at some of these indicators, there still is quite a bit of strength. Why do you think the threshold is 0.2% on core CPI or below in the reading that we get on Thursday, and then it's all clear for September?
Well, that's the framework that I'm using for this week and how I think markets will react. Right now, you're kind of at a 50-50 on a cut in September, and I think by the end of the week, it's either going to be very close to 100% or that's going to start drifting down below 50% again. But you know, I would say that right now, actually, the data is very clear, and it's sending a green light to the Fed that they actually can adjust policy. So let's just take a very simple approach. Think about the Taylor rule, right? The Taylor rule has two functions. It's the inflation loss function and the job loss function. Well, right now, inflation is coming down and the unemployment rate is rising. Both variables are actually telling you that it's okay, particularly when policy is restrictive as it is, to start moving the policy rate down. Now we're really just talking about the semantics of exactly when they go. But in terms of, is the overall economy appropriate to start thinking about that reduction, I would say yes.
So if Neil Dutta is listening to this, he's banging the table saying, yes, 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 because that's what he's been saying. Just look at unemployment, look at inflation, that's all you need to know. They're both giving the green light. Some people might say, look at policy. Look at what's coming down the pike with tariffs, looking at what's coming down the pike with immigration, regardless of who becomes president. Doesn't this sort of raise the risks of sort of a reignition of inflation down the line, in addition to just year-over-year comps that become less easy, as they have been over the past couple of months?
That's fair. I do think that for the short term, I'm still more focused on the economic data, and I think that on a day-to-day, you may see the markets react or overreact to the politics, but the market will again refocus on the near-term data because we know that markets can't focus on more than one thing at a time. But that being said, you know, I know that we're focused on these huge headline figures for tariffs, 60% tariff rates, 90% tariff rates. But when I think back about the experience we had with the trade wars in the prior administration, the real impact from tariffs was not the inflation impact. It was the negative growth impact. So I think people are maybe a little bit too focused on the inflation impulse and a little not focused enough on what this may do for global trade and global sentiment and the negative growth impact associated with it.
If it's going to be more of a negative growth impact than inflationary impact, does that mean that the Fed is right also to cut before potentially we see those policy shifts?
I don't think that they're going to react before any of these policy shifts. So again, that's why, as it relates to how we're positioning portfolios for the next few months, I'm still primarily focused on what is happening in the current data, what is happening in the current economy, what is happening currently to companies. And then I think what's really key with our portfolios is not to be too dogmatic, not to be too stuck in one view, to stay nimble, to stay tactical, because there's been a lot of opportunities even in the last week. You know, I think my colleague Ian was on talking about the elections in France. We mentioned that we were nibbling at oats. I mean, that was a classic overreaction, a period of time where it was short-lived, the market was focused on it, but then look what happened as the week progressed. We refocused on ISM services, we refocused on the jobs report, and ultimately those opportunities to nibble were good ones.
Oats being French bonds and not breakfast, Kelsey, just to sort of clear that for our audience who maybe aren't.
You're just talking straight to me. I nibble on oats every morning.
With European bonds. Kelsey, what else have you been doing? What other opportunities have there been over the last month or so? Have you responded to that backup in yields off the back of political considerations here in the United States as well?
Yeah, we did. Yeah, that was kind of an interesting confluence of events, but we certainly looked at the price action, and I vividly remember it last Monday, and yields were backing up fairly substantially. We're testing 450 on 10s or getting closer to it, and it was on nothing related to the fundamentals in the U.S. economy. And you know, those are the moments when you can really look to yourself and say, okay, when the price action is really being driven by technicals, really being driven by factors that are outside the purview of the U.S. economy, do we have a view on what's coming next? And in that case, the risk reward looked actually very...
Just quickly, is that the playbook for the summer for you guys? If you get backups on yields off the back of political considerations, not economic data or the Federal Reserve, that's something you want to buy?
We have been approaching it that way. And we have to continue to stay nimble. But I do think that when you're looking at the risk reward on the labor market, we talked about the risk that it could be weakening. If the market is backing up for reasons unrelated to the fundamentals, that's a buying opportunity.
Kelsey, this was great. Phenomenal to get some insight into what you've been doing over the last month or so. Kelsey Barrow there of JP Morgan. It's like the political considerations versus the fundamentals, the economic data. At some point, though, those political considerations can become the fundamentals.
Well, but what are the fundamentals? And I think that Kelsey's point there is really salient, which is some of these tariffs might have a one-time pop in inflation, in the prices going up, but it's not continued inflation. It's actually depressive to growth because people will buy less. So this is sort of some of the dynamic that people are looking at under the hood and saying, hold up, let's just really take a look at what the ramifications are.
We'll continue this conversation in the second hour of Bloomberg Surveillance. Up next, we'll catch up with Peter Chair at Academy Securities, Bloomberg's Jordan Fabian, Democratic donor and advisor Trey Beck, and Wei Li of BlackRock. All of that still to come from New York City. Good morning.
From the world of politics to the world of business, every weekday on Bloomberg TV and radio, hosts Joe Matthew and Keely Lines deliver news, insight, and analysis from and about politics' biggest power players.
The president has been clear that is non-negotiable.
I mean, this is going to be an ugly, ugly year.
Balance of Power, live around the world every weekday, only on Bloomberg Television and Radio. Context changes everything.
Looking at your portfolio of businesses, it is about resilience, it's about pressure, it's about women. Like,
yes.
How does that come together how does it manifest in the deals that you're doing now?
Yeah, it's one of the things that I became increasingly passionate about after I retired, was acknowledging the fact that focus and this performance mindset was a huge asset that I had gained and that I had worked on and perfected for over 20 years. And now working through brands and founders, I just recently announced a collaboration with the Amman Hotel Group where I bring in the best talents in sports recovery and performance mindset in retreats and offering it there to their clientele. Our first one is actually in Phuket in February. So working through what that means, I mean, if you see the stats of Fortune 500 female CEOs, 80% of those women have played sport competitively through their life journey. And all those skill sets that they've built, to me, they were part of this first chapter, right? But how do they now apply to everything else I'm doing? And I'm so curious and interested in how I can bring that to the audience now and make it more mainstream and accessible.
From the beating heart of global finance, economics, and politics, and wherever newsmakers are moving markets. Bloomberg brings you conversations that allow for deep discussions and important insights. What do you think the future is for inflation? Is this new normal? Are markets too optimistic? How do you worry about the things that are outside your control? How does the current fighting completely stop? I'm Francine Lacqua, and this is The Pulse, every weekday only on Bloomberg.
What's helping to support the market is the majority expectation that we will experience a soft landing.
As you're approaching a soft landing, you have to obviously increase the odds that the hard landing is actually where you end up.
We've seen kind of head fakes before with the soft data and the hard data.
The Fed has to make the policy stance less restrictive sooner rather than later.
If they don't start to respond to what we're seeing in the consumer and the economy broadly, then we have a higher risk of that hard landing scenario that everyone was so fearful of.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Jonathan Farrell, Lisa Abramowitz, and Anne-Marie Hordern.
The second hour of Bloomberg Surveillance begins right now, counting you down to day one of semi-annual testimony for Chairman Powell on Capitol Hill a little bit later this morning in front of the Senate Banking Committee. Ahead of that, some of the commentary for you from the South Side. Neil Dutta, good friend of this program, over at Renmac. The cost of doing nothing is going up. Citi's Andrew Honhorst thinks this labour market is getting closer and closer to the so-called danger zone. Andrew with this to say, rising unemployment, rising downside risk.
Which is what we've heard an increasing number of people, including Kelsey Barrow, just saying basically they have an opening, they're getting the green light from unemployment going up and the fact that inflation's coming down. That's all you need to know. That's the same kind of line of reasoning that we've heard from Neil Dutta. Here's the question. Does he want to lock them in? Because if he says that and the data doesn't change and they have to go in September, is that what he wants to do, given he might not have the rest of the committee on his side?
A pretty interesting double screen taking place a little bit later this morning, 10 a.m. Eastern time. Take a look at the day ahead. This is what it looks like. At the same time, we'll be taking coverage of Chairman Powell's testimony to the Senate. Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, goes in front of the House. And I imagine one might be about the economy and the other might be about something else.
She's supposed to talk about international finance. So you're going to hear a lot of people also want to talk about what's going on with those Russian frozen assets and some of the progress the administration has made, especially after the G7. But obviously, when it comes to Republicans asking her questions, it's going to be about, is the President of the United States, she is a member, a serious member of his cabinet, is he fit to serve? That's entirely what the next 24 hours in Washington, D.C. is going to be about.
Yeah, although, okay, it's hard to say that she's actually going to weigh in on that. Are they also going to ask her about the deficit, given that you're having all of these auctions, that this is still sort of percolating out there? I'm serious. I want to know what she has to say about the financing of this country.
Only you could make the turn to that, from the health of the president to the bond issues coming up a little bit later.
Is she going to say anything about the president's health?
She's going to be asked.
She's going to be asked.
Without a doubt.
She's going to have to say, I have confidence in the president. Let's move forward, right? I mean, this is basically going to be the question. You could say, how much does it diminish the United States on the world stage that we're having these discussions? How much does that actually challenge some of the negotiations around Ukrainian aid? I'd love to hear that. And I also want to hear, how much does this diminish his ability to get certain things done having to do with the deficit?
She's probably practicing her answers now because she is going to be asked this question over and over and over again today. This is a moment for Republicans also to clip it ahead of their November campaigns in their districts.
All roads lead to one thing for Bramo. It's the deficit in the United States of America. Here are the scores in the bond market. We look like this on treasuries. Unbelievable. The 10-year at the moment yields higher by a single basis point. The 10-year 4.29. In the FX market, bit of a snooze, 108.23 on the euro. In the equity market, nothing snoozy about it. 5 days of gains, looking like we might make it 6. On the S&P 500, equity futures positive by 0.25%. of 1%. Coming up this hour, we'll catch up with Academy's Peter Cheer as the S&P 500 reaches another all-time high. Democratic donor Trey Beck as President Biden vows to stay in the race, and BlackRock's Wei Li on whether AI can keep driving the equity rally. We begin with our top story. Stocks hitting fresh record highs as investors await Fed Chair Jay Powell's testimony. Academy's Peter Cheer writing this: we have argued quite aggressively that the Fed should make their first cut in July, partly because the economic data supports it, but also taking the spotlight off of the Fed in the heat of the election. Peter joins us now for more. Pete, good morning.
Morning.
Two reasons. One's about the economy. The second is about the politics. So let's start with the second one, the politics. Why is that an important consideration for this Federal Reserve?
Well, I'm going to start with the first one, but basically every guest has been on saying September looks likely. They should be doing it. They should be acting sooner than later. I completely agree. And if anything, I would err to the side that they do it in July. If you do this in September, I just envision a world where this is going to blow up in social media. Clearly, if they cut in September, say stocks rally 3-5%, you will see the Trump campaign aggressively go after the Fed, blame them for playing favorites. It won't be the case, but the reality doesn't mean anything anymore, right? It's how these things play out in the social media narrative is what's important. You do the first cut in July, you'll get some flack, but it's July 31st. No one cares, it'll quiet down, and you can move on, and you set up a September rate cut, I think, much easier. That's how I would play it. You know, maybe you're not supposed to think that way, but to me it makes the most sense.
We've drawn a distinction repeatedly this morning between what they should do and what they will do. This is what you think they should do. What do you think they will do, and what do you expect to hear today from Chairman Powell this morning?
I think they're going to set us up for September. I think they're going to continue to look at the data. I think the data is going to come in weak. I'm hopeful that CPI comes in low enough. Maybe it lets them squeeze towards July, but I think it's already too late with the messaging. So I think we get that September cut, 25 then, another 25 in November, and then 25 in December. So we get 75 this year.
Some people would say that just because the Fed has even signaled the cut, we've already gotten the easing in financial conditions that have given a shot of stimulus to the economy. Why is that not the case as we have just experienced the 35th record high of this year?
Well, so for example, I just pulled up the equal weighted S&P, which month to date is down 0.2%. Year to date is up 3.5%. So this market has been very narrow rally, right? It's really all about AI, the AI story, this transitional. So I don't think we should set policy based on the excitement over AI, right? If AI is real, it might still be undervalued. So when you look at the broad market, you know, the Russell 2000 still done poorly, value stocks. So I think we get caught up in the broad indices. You look below the surface, markets are only doing okay. I think the job data is turning, it's turning fairly quickly. And with inflation around 2.8% or somewhere in that neighborhood, you don't want to risk a recession. Back when we were 5%, the Fed could afford to risk a recession, right? Inflation was so bad, so painful, they could do that. Now there's no reason to create a recession. So all those reasons tell me cut now, even if financial conditions look pretty decent. And what I've liked in the last week or so, 2s, 10s is widening. And I do think one thing people are going to find mistaken this time is even as the Fed cuts, I don't think 10s and 30s are going to respond that much. I think 10s and 30s are going to focus on the deficit, the supply, and you're going to see 2s, 10s go back to zero, maybe slightly, even uninverted over time, and you're going to see that 430 to 450 range on 10s hold, even when the Fed begins cutting rates.
There's a lot to unpack there. Let's go to the deficit. I am curious about how much the politics of the moment. You guys are laughing at me. No, I'm serious, because this is something that people talk about. We just had Kelsey Barrow on saying, buy the 10-year. I know you guys are laughing at my obsession. It is important at a time, especially when you have all of the bond auctions this week. How much are you looking at that as something that sort of takes away the opportunity to really buy into weakness?
So again, I think that's why yields are going to stay somewhat high, stubbornly high at the long end. It comes up in conversation after conversation. And what I try and bring back is, if you remember August and September last year, where treasuries were for sale every single day. I think we went from 4% to 5%. No matter what the data was, maybe we'd rally briefly, treasuries would go for sale. There was a huge fixation on the deficit, our willingness to kind of talk about not paying. You're going to see episodes of that. It's not going to be nonstop. It's not consistent, right? Because this deficit's going to take time. But I would expect every year or so you get that sort of noise. Even earlier this year, right? We went from 390 to 470. Same sort of trend. So I think more and more you're going to see these breaks to the upside on yields because people fixate on the deficit, and neither party is going to change that.
But you don't buy those dips in price.
Not until we get high enough in that range, because I think everyone's comfortable with treasuries right now. I think people position too long. So down here at 430, I'm selling treasuries. Maybe they go to 420. I think we get back to 450 before long, even with the Fed cutting. I think that's going to be the realization is, yeah, whatever the Fed's doing at the front end is great, but it doesn't solve the deficit problem. It doesn't solve our long-term debt problems. And this overall supply is still real. So that's why I'm not that comfortable with the long end.
Can we go back to the optics, the political optics of the September cut? Take that a step further. It's not just going to be that the Trump campaign would come out and maybe say, they're in the tank for President Biden. If Trump is elected, does this give him the excuse with his own party to go back to that Wall Street Journal report, which is that they want to blunt the independence of the Fed?
Yeah, I think over the last year or so, right, there's a lot more both from Trump and others talking about the Fed's independence, questioning, Congress, what Congress says over the Fed. I think if they cut in September, it leaves them much more open to, under a new administration, attack about what their mandate is, whether they have to be rule followers, how much flexibility they have. Again, I think all of that may play out one way or the other. I think it's less likely if they do this in July. And again, the data is there for them to think about cutting. And you would argue, right, I think other people there's this lag effect. Why not get a couple cuts in earlier? I just feel it would be very prudent and better for the Fed's long-term health and independence to get something done sooner than later.
And does he need to signal that today?
I think he should be pretty strong about if we get good enough data in the coming weeks, we could cut sooner. And that kind of gives him a little bit of, like CPI, I think will actually be a miss, so it'll be lower than expected, so I don't know whether that's now a miss or a win anymore, and however we want to interpret it, but I think we'll get a lower CPI, and any problems with CPI will either be one-off things explainable, or they'll be housing-related, which everyone now knows is lagged effect. It's one reason the Fed looks at PCE, and I've been learning more and more about this, but supposedly it would take an act of Congress to change how CPI uses that, which is why people go to CP. You look at anything like Zillow or anything that's kind of contemporaneous rent, rents come way down, so it's artificially inflated. I think those are the things that give him the leeway between the jobs report and that to put July on the table.
Kelsey Barrow was with us about 10, 15 minutes ago, and she really drew a distinction between cutting interest rates to fine-tune policy in response to disinflation and cutting interest rates in response to a much weaker labour market. Now, I said that there were bearish rate cuts and bullish rate cuts. I'd actually like your opinion on that. Do bearish rate cuts exist? Are there rate cuts that are bearish for this market?
I think it's all relative what's been priced in. So right now, I think, yeah, if we had a really steep drop in employment, then we get a bearish rate cut, and maybe equities couldn't keep up and couldn't keep going. But as it stands right now, I think everything's going to be really positive. I think we're all sitting there trying to watch what triggers this breakout, though, of the Russell 2000, the value, the equal weighted versus. That still, to me, isn't clear, right? It feels to me we've been on this path where the data is good enough, you should see the broad economy doing well. The Fed's accommodating enough, you should do that. And those still aren't working.
We all remember November 2016, and we've talked about this a few times. Small caps rallied almost 11% in November 2016 on the Trump election. I think the question we've all gone back to around the table in the last couple of weeks is just how relevant that playbook is this time around. Is it relevant at all?
I'm kind of ignoring most of the election stuff. I think, one, it's too clear what's going to go on, who's going to be even representing, and I think we see time and time again, right? Whatever they say they're going to do, the policies wind up coming much more narrow. I've been a big fan of Mexico recently, right? There was a lot of concern after the Mexican elections that it would change. You saw the Mexican pace. All that's coming back to normal, right? Whatever you say to get elected and whatever you wind up doing tend to be two very different things. So I'm paying very little attention to any of the rhetoric. And I would say, on top of all of it is, it feels that people are very willing to put their own interpretations on it. So if you're
hold up. If we get politically induced dislocations in the markets through this summer, you're a buyer. You take
I am
the other
generally
side.
a buyer, yes.
That's exactly what Kelsey Barrow said 10 minutes ago.
Even though her sense of what to buy was somewhat different. So that's, I guess, my question to you. What are you a buyer of during these dislocations?
So the one thing I would say, maybe slightly different, is I do like energy. And I would say when you look at the world right now, you've got Putin, dictator, Xi, dictator, Kim, dictator, Khomeini, effectively a dictator. They have to be looking at what's going on here, and they probably don't understand our political system, but they see the leader of the free world, the commander-in-chief, internally focused, facing all these questions. I think the risk that someone takes some action and tries to take advantage of that over the summer is much higher. So I am looking for the potential for a geopolitical risk. That I would not fade, and that's why I kind of want to own commodities ahead of that. I think almost anything that gets done would affect energy prices in particular. And on top of that, not quite even in that same vein, We're sitting here, all this internal focus. Oban's traveling to Russia, right? Putin and Modi met. The rest of the world's moving on while we're internally focused. That I don't like for the future.
I've got to squeeze this in. You're surrounded by generals at Academy. You just said take advantage. What does taking advantage look like? What does that mean?
You know, I think if you watch what's going on, right, the last time we did funding for Ukraine, right, a lot of this plays out in social media, how difficult that was to get over the hurdle. You watch what's been going on with Israel and Gaza, where we're supposed to support, what we're not supposed to do, a lot, again, plays out in social media. So we're having a lot of activity around the Second Thomas Shoal in the Philippines, a couple hundred miles off the coast of Philippines. Would anyone really care? What would we do if something like that? So I think we're already stretched. We're engaged in 2 wars. Neither of those are going smoothly, certainly by any stretch of the imagination. So do you push the envelope? Do you do something different? I think China could do something. Maybe, North Korea's been extremely quiet. Do you get weapon sales? Something to just shake it up where they view that, 1, we're stretched, 2, they can use misinformation, social media to push against us, and the time frame is right for that, where we already had enough questions without their misinformation.
Pete, we could do this all hour. It's good to see you. I know you've got to go. Peter Cheer there of Academy Securities. So let's get you an update on stories elsewhere this morning with your Bloomberg Brief. Here's Danny Berger. Hey, Danny.
Hey, John. A check on BP shares in the London trade down 4 1/3% after warning of weaker oil refining and write-downs. Boeing sees significantly lower refining margins and says it will take up to $2 billion in impairments in the second quarter. The figure includes charges related to scaling back refining operations in Germany due to high costs and decline in fuel demand. Donald Trump says that he hasn't decided who will be his vice presidential pick. He was speaking to Fox's Sean Hannity and said that he plans to make an announcement in the coming week. The former president said his running mate would be, quote, a person that can do a fantastic job as president, as well as somebody that helps you get elected, and there's nothing wrong with that. Trump said Senators J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, Tim Scott, and North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum were under consideration. Hamad International Airport in Qatar takes the top spot in this year's Air Help survey of the world's best airports. The rankings are partially based on customer feedback, along with the quality of food and shopping at 239 airports globally. Punctual arrivals and departures represent 60% of the score. Rounding out the top 3 were Cape Town International Airport in South Africa and Churu Centrar International Airport in Japan. 1 U.S. airport cracked the top 10, and that was Salt Lake City International Airport. And that's your brief, John.
And nobody's surprised. Danny, thank you. We'll catch up with Danny in about 30 minutes' time. I love this country. It's just the airports, okay? Just for the record.
I just want to say,
just the airports.
LaGuardia has gotten a lot better.
I agree.
Comparatively to what it was, but when you stack it up against airports around the world, is it that great? Also, the traffic getting in and out. It's awful.
At JFK is just, I know. How long have we got to wait now? 2 years?
Yeah, okay.
To fix JFK?
I agree. And getting in and out, you might as well just take public transportation. It's better off, just a PSA. Newark does look like you're flying into a third world country.
Yes, it really does. Up next on the program, the White House firing back.
Has the president been treated for Parkinson's? No. Is he being treated for Parkinson's? No, he's not. Is he taking medication for Parkinson's? No. So those are the things that I can give you full-blown answers on.
Coming out swinging yesterday, line of the morning, favorite line of the morning so far. If you missed this, it was an absolute winner. There's a lot to unpack. So let's talk about the deficit. Does it get better than that? Peter could have been talking about anything.
Okay, hold on a second. He was talking about the deficit, which is the reason why he's not buying treasuries when they dip. Those are not the opportunities. It was actually relevant to the conversation.
Got it. All right. That's not next. This is Bloomberg.
multi-trillion dollar industry. There's a lot of ground to cover.
Bitcoin ETFs rubbing elbows with the big dogs.
This frenzy has engulfed the entire world.
We'll show you what's happening in ETFs like no one else. Bloomberg ETF IQ, only on Bloomberg.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
DOJ or other authorities
could face bigger challenges next.
It was going to keep real World Cup. This is a thrill.
As the economic picture
Covering the intersections of Hollywood, Silicon Valley, and beyond.
Stocks on the S&P 500 positive here by 0.2%. Let's talk about the deficit. Yields are higher by, I'm going to repeat that all morning. Yields are higher by a basis point or two. The 10-year 429.59. Under surveillance this morning, the White House firing back.
I can tell you this, just going back to Parkinson's for a little bit, so to give you some answers here. Has the president been treated for Parkinson's? No. Is he being treated for Parkinson's? No, he's not. Is he taking medication for Parkinson's? No. So those are the things that I can give you full-blown answers on, but I'm not going to confirm a specialist, any specialist that comes to the White House out of privacy.
So here's the latest. President Biden vowing to stay in the race despite mounting concerns over his fitness for a second term. White House visitor logs showing 8 visits in the past year by a neurologist specializing in Parkinson's disease. Joining us now from Washington is Bloomberg's Jordan Fabian. Jordan, have you ever seen that room as hostile as it was in this administration?
It was one of a handful of moments where things got very heated, and these moments have tended to happen when the press secretary is not forthcoming about something that was plainly obvious to everyone in the room. And this was, as you just mentioned, a neurologist who specializes in Parkinson's disease visiting the White House complex 8 times. Now, it took the White House until yesterday evening to say why that Dr. Kevin Kennard was at the White House, that he was conducting clinical consultations, treating some other military members. But her stonewalling in the middle of the day just made the story worse for the White House. It certainly got the hackles up of the reporters in the room.
Jordan, I woke up to that letter from the president's physician in my inbox and thought, why did it take them hours to get ahead of this? The story has been circulating for a few days. Why is it taking them so long to get ahead of all of these issues, including Biden yesterday coming out swinging? Why did it take him a week after the debate?
Yeah, it's puzzling. These are all good questions, Anne-Marie, and there's no real clear answers to them. This is a press operation throughout Biden's presidency that has struggled to get the message out, that has struggled to get ahead of stories, as you just mentioned, to drive the narrative on what they want to talk about versus getting put on their back foot. And that was another example that happened yesterday. The problem for them is the stakes are incredibly high, and any misstep at this moment, post-debate for Biden, is going to get examined 10 times more intensely. And so they haven't adjusted their approach. They only started this full court press to try to save Biden's presidency more than a week after that debate. And that's why they're digging out of such a deep hole that they're in.
Jordan, John brought this up earlier, and it was that moment a few days ago with Justin Sink and Karine Jean-Pierre about the, quote, big boy press conference. What can we expect from the president on Thursday?
Well, Thursday at 5:30 or so, he's going to appear before the press. And look, I mean, we're going to have to see whether this qualifies as a so-called big boy press conference, as my colleague Justin put it. Is he going to stand up there for an hour, take questions, all comers, or is this going to be a tightly controlled affair like we've seen throughout this White House? A lot of Democrats, it's emblematic because a lot of Democrats have wanted to see Biden put himself in more unscripted settings, speak more off the cuff. And we've seen him do a little bit of that. He's done the interview with George Stephanopoulos. He called into Morning Joe yesterday morning on MSNBC. But he hasn't really let it loose like other presidents I've covered who've just been unafraid to take all questions, all comers. So we'll have to see if Biden does it on Thursday. And if he doesn't, there could be more backlash that he could face from his fellow Democrats.
And Jordan, there's already been quite a bit of backlash. We've been talking about the Democratic elected officials that have come out saying that Joe Biden should step down. Why are the progressives, one of the wings, that are now actually coming out with aggressive support for the sitting president?
Well, one thing we've seen, Lisa, is groups that make up Biden's base. So like labor unions, voters of color, have been some of the most outspoken supporters of Joe Biden since this debate crisis occurred. And the more vocal segments of the party that have been calling him to step aside are the donors, some of the party consultants, more of the so-called elites that Joe Biden called out in his interview yesterday morning. And so I think you're seeing some of those progressive members respond to their constituents, respond to the people who support them, and voicing their support in that way. And so what you're seeing Joe Biden do is actually kind of divide his party between black voters, union voters, and the so-called elites. Now, that might help him save his presidency in the short term, but in the long term, you're heading into a November election with a divided party against Donald Trump, who has the Republican Party in an iron grip. That's going to probably hurt his chances of winning even further.
Jordan, just a thought exercise. Do you think if the former president could move the RNC, the convention, maybe a couple of weeks, do you think he'd push it back?
That's a great point, Jonathan. He's been content to sit back and just let the storm clouds gather around Biden. But look, this is Donald Trump. I mean, he's playing a disciplined politician now, but this is a guy who has constantly gotten in his own way throughout his time in politics. And I'm sure, he is itching to get out there and say things. And look, if you look at his true social account, the social media accounts, he was on Sean Hannity last night. He's been itching to get out there. He likes the spotlight on him, whether it's good or bad for him. So, maybe his consultants want the debate to happen at a later date, but I'm sure Donald Trump wants to get up on that stage.
Hey, Jordan, great to get your views. Come back soon. Jordan Fabian there of Bloomberg News on the week ahead for the sitting president, and a big week next week for the former president.
Absolutely, it's the RNC, so he has to come out with his VP pick. He said it himself. I'd love to maybe wait, maybe I'll do it at the RNC. My team says I gotta go. He's got to announce.
The next couple of days, we're all waiting for it. Up next on the program, Trey Beck, Democratic donor and former managing director of D.E. Shaw Investment Management, joining us on this program. Looking forward to his thoughts just around the corner. If you're checking it on the price action right now, on the S&P 500, equity futures are positive by 0.2%. Yields are a little bit higher on a 10-year by 2 basis points. Your yield this morning, 429.78.
Bloomberg covers the world with unmatched reach and resources. From more than 120 countries, the moment news breaks, 24 hours a day. Bloomberg, context changes everything.
This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
Equities on the S&P firmer here, positive by 0.2% on the Nasdaq 100, up by a third, another all-time high to close yesterday on the S&P 500. If you switch at the board and get to the bond market, 2-year, 10-year, 30-year, let's talk about the deficit, Bramo. Okay, let's talk about the debt that's coming to market today. $58 billion of 3-year notes. And then tomorrow, $39 billion of 10-year notes. Day after, Lisa, $22 billion of 30-year bonds. I don't need to tell you that. You know these numbers by heart.
Okay, so some people might say, why should we care about the deficit? Why should we care about these auctions? You don't care about them until you do. This is the reason why we've seen this sort of range that the bond, long bond in particular, has been trading in. We heard from Kelsey Barrow, buy the dip, buy any kind of sell-off in longer-term bonds on political noise. Then you have Peter Scheer, also buy the dip to political noise, but not with treasuries, because he thinks that actually they're going to sell off further. And why? Because of the deficit. This is the reason why you might see a bigger term premium than you otherwise might see. I think it's interesting.
I'm pleased you brought up Kelsey and Peter just to extend some of this conversation. There is a tug of war right now between political considerations and the decelerating economic data, the fundamentals, so to speak, and the political speculation. But at some point, that political speculation can become real, can actually influence the fundamentals. And I think that's what's difficult for a lot of people right now. What do you do with these so-called political dislocations in the market when this could get more and more real as the year progresses and we get closer and closer to November?
And exactly to that point, Kelsey and Peter had completely, actually opposed views on how to take advantage of political dislocations. Because the view of exactly how this is going to play out, whether it's going to play out in policy or not, or whether the economy is going to just overwhelm that, or whether it's going to be basically played out in the international sphere with some sort of geopolitical incident. By the way, Peter's saying that some of these leaders don't really understand the U.S. political system. I think at this point, a fair number of us might also have some difficulties.
Yeah, I think all of us included right now, given the way the last week's gone. We'll try and give some clarity if we can in the next couple of minutes. Let's switch to the board and get to the euro, the single currency. Things have been confusing in Europe. They always are. In the FX market, the euro is 108.17. We're negative by 0.06%. Some stability off the back of the second round of voting in France, and I guess we'll take that, Lisa, after the mess of the last few weeks.
And you've seen this play out in the bond market as well, at least with respect to the spread between French bond yields and German bond yields. Question is, really, has anything been resolved? And the answer is a resounding no. So is this just basically people thinking about the worst case scenario, or is this just simply the people who are nibbling on oats, as Kelsey Barrow
Nibbling
was saying?
on oats.
Yeah.
I love that. It sounded like breakfast.
Well, it is breakfast
really
for me.
Yeah,
I like oats.
French bonds is breakfast for you. Bramo, killer line. Under surveillance this morning, United Airlines saying one of its Boeing jets lost a wheel while taking off yesterday in Los Angeles. It's nearly a repeat of an incident in March that helped trigger a federal safety review of the carrier. Okay, I don't have the answers, but I've got a big question. And we'll ask Elaine Becker a little bit later this morning in about 45 minutes. At what point do we stop talking about Boeing and start talking about the airlines when you see incidents like this take place?
Well, obviously it's not good for either of them. It's deja vu, and not the good kind of deja vu, because this exactly happened to the carrier in March. But and that launched the FAA investigation. But it's a great question. Is this a Boeing issue or is this a United issue? Because it happened once again to United. And I think that's what this investigation, the FAA, is going to try to find out.
And it's difficult to really parse because United does have a disproportionately high number of Boeing planes. So there is this sort of duality of it. I will say, though, it might be a similar problem plaguing both of them, which is there were a lot of employees who retired with a lot of institutional knowledge, including a lot of the tech staff, et cetera. How much was that the problem, both with Boeing and potentially even United support staff, if you lose that expertise in a highly skilled profession, and it's hard to hire those people back.
And the sky's too busy as well. With that in mind, relative to the absence of the expertise that you've just described?
You know, it's difficult for me to say because I enjoy traveling, and if I say the skies are too crowded, that means less volume, which means much higher prices, and that would be a big problem. We don't see planes crashing in the air, so, you know, hopefully we can move forward.
Record numbers over the weekend. Thanks for that, Lisa. I think we're all touching wood after that. Let's get to a different story. US consumer borrowing rising in May by the most in 3 months. Total credit outstanding soaring to $11.4 billion after a revised $6.5 billion gain in April. This all according to Federal Reserve data. This once again extends the conversation around what we talk about in the labor market, which is what is normal and what is deterioration when you look at stats like that.
Does it mean that people don't have the income to support the spending and are therefore borrowing as a result? These are the kinds of indications people are looking at to understand the turn in the cycle. That's really the key. At what point are we turning into something that's a little bit more malignant than just sort of a welcome softening?
This is the hard data that's come up in that recent Michigan survey when you had people saying that they normally identify as the middle class, but they feel like they are now in the lower income stratosphere of the electorate. You see this in polls and polls again. Inflation. This is what people are struggling with, and this data shows that potentially now they're relying on credit cards.
Unemployment's very low still, in the low 4s, but this consumer's stretched in certain places, and for a long time, those labour market stats at the aggregate level, the headline level, have masked what's happening beneath the surface.
I wonder if you dig beneath the surface of these numbers, whether there's a disproportionate number of younger people, of people in lower and middle income families who account for that much bigger than expected increase in borrowing.
We'll come back to that story a little bit later. I want to turn to this one. It's been the #1 story for the last 2 weeks in this country. President Biden is now pledging to stay in the race, brushing aside concern from Democratic lawmakers and donors. Biden saying, I don't care what the millionaires think. I want their support. But that's not the reason I'm running. Democratic donor Trey Beck saying he would like to see Biden drop out. Trey, I'm pleased to say, joins us now. Trey, wonderful to catch up with you, sir. For people in the audience who aren't familiar with you, can you just share with us how you've supported Democratic causes, this president, in years gone by, and what changed for you 2 Thursdays ago?
So I've been a defender of President Biden as, first of all, his presidency. I think by any objective measure, he's done an extraordinary job. You know, he has passed 2 infrastructure bills, one of them bipartisan, CHIPS bill, prescription drugs, addressing, you know, real issues for Americans. And I think on a sort of degree of difficulty adjusted basis, if you consider he's facing an incredibly hostile opposition, one that in many cases doesn't even recognize the, you know, legitimacy of his clear win in 2020, right? Those are the conditions in which he's operating. I think he can make a case he's the best Democratic president of my lifetime in terms of what he has accomplished. I supported him in 2020. I supported him again in this cycle. And to be clear, however this resolves, I will support him or whoever the Democratic nominee is. And I think that's an important note. I think whatever happens with this, you know, inter-family squabble, we're going to have to unify around our candidate. And if that's Biden, I will get behind him. I'll walk on glass for the guy. What's changed is that the debate confirmed, you know, the concerns that I think everybody had. And I think most notably voters. I think the Biden campaign has very understandably come out and shrewdly attacked this as sort of a cabal led by elites or donors, millionaires, in that quote you just showed. If I were them, that's what I'd say too. But I think what's actually happening here is that, in a sense, donors and the electeds who've come out, and I've talked to electeds privately who share their concerns and would like a change, but are not there yet to do it publicly, and I understand some of the calculations there. I think what's happening is people are coming around to exactly the view that voters have been expressing through polls for a year. I think that's what's going on. And so I think that what the debate confirmed, and for that matter, the radio interview he did and the Stephanopoulos interview, they have confirmed the degree of impairment from age. So it's true, everyone knew that, you know, this was an 81-year-old man running for president, and that's hard. What we were hoping for was that he was anomalous and that he would have the stamina and acuity to do this. And I think what a lot of people are saying now is we need a candidate who can express, who can make the case, with the vigor that this moment deserves, given the authoritarian threat that we face in Trump and the administration that he would install.
Trey, is the concern with you and the people you're speaking with about Biden winning in November or Biden's ability to govern for the next 4 years?
I think the two are related, right? So historically, Biden has represented a vote for safety. In 2020, he was, old by the standards of somebody running for president, but he was considered establishment. He was coherent. He was not saying crazy things and threatening authoritarian policies like the alternative, which was Donald Trump. I think what some voters are struggling with now is they already know Trump is a bad guy. They know he lies. They know he's literally a criminal. He's a convicted criminal. They know he is threatening policy implementation that they don't agree with, whether it's reproductive rights, firing, much of the civil service and installing loyalists, using the judiciary to punish people. But they're struggling with this because they now see a less vigorous Joe Biden. And I don't blame Joe Biden for this. I believe that the Biden campaign, when they greenlit this campaign, had a different candidate. And I think what we've seen is significant impairment. I'm not a doctor, but I saw what I saw, and others saw what they saw. And we need somebody to make the case during the campaign. And then, of course, should we win, and I fervently hope we do, we want someone with the vigor to do one of the hardest jobs in the world. Now, I want to make clear, I don't have any substantive concerns about Biden's age. You're not electing one person, you're electing a team, in my mind, and many, many people I know understand this. You're talking about an army of bureaucrats, high and low. And I know the team that Trump is assembling. I know what he assembled previously, and what he's talking about doing now is worse and frightening. And I know that Biden is surrounded by hyper-competent people handling things domestically and abroad. But, the way most voters see it is they see two names on the ballot, or in this case, maybe 3 or 4, depending on the state they live in.
But Trey, didn't his team around him do the American people a disservice by hiding a lot of these issues that they have over the past few months that we saw out full display for 90 minutes on CNN 2 Thursdays ago?
A lot of people are making that case. I don't know what the campaign sees. I don't know what his staff sees on a day-to-day basis. I'm not here to make that sort of allegation, of a cover-up. What I'll say is we did see what we saw. I think we've seen things previously, and people rightly say, well, haven't there been signs of decline or physical impairment, slower gait, et cetera, prior to the debate? Absolutely. But I think what we were hoping was that those were anomalous. And I think when we saw on the biggest stage the performance we saw, it confirmed a lot of people's concerns.
Yeah, well, Trey, there's also this issue of whether Joe Biden is currently operating at the same playbook, with the same playbook, in some ways that Donald Trump is, by just simply coming out and being defiant and saying, people get in line.
Yeah, so on the one hand, I do find that dispiriting that, he's describing, everyone as either a cabal of elites or, acting in bad faith. On the other hand, the positive of that is he's fighting, and he's showing the sort of scrappy Joe that got him elected. His campaign has clearly mobilized and forced to, enlist allies. Now, a lot has been made of those allies and saying, well, look, the labor movement, people of color who are historically, critical to his political power are lining up behind him. I think that's a very, good political line of attack by them, but I don't think it's substantively true. I think what you've seen is elites from those, labor union leaders lining up behind them. And by the way, privately, labor union leaders have expressed grave concerns to me. I've also, I can cite any number of polls that show that people of color are deeply concerned about Biden's age. Something like 64% of all voters would like Biden replaced on the ticket. and that includes 55% of black voters. So I think it's substantively not true that the average person of color who's a voter has no concerns at all about Biden's age.
Trey, appreciate your input today. We're going to have to do this again soon. Trey Beck there, the Democratic donor, on the latest with the president, and how much things changed for him 2 Thursdays ago. Let's take the opportunity to get you an update on stories elsewhere this morning with your Bloomberg Brief. Here's Danny Berger. Hey, Danny.
Hey, John. Nike is bringing back a retired executive to try to revive its slumping sales. According to a memo obtained by Bloomberg, 30-year veteran executive Tom Petty is returning as Nike's vice president of marketplace partners. He left Nike in 2020. Now the company is trying to rebuild relationships with retailers like Foot Locker after pulling products from many stores in favor of its own shops, e-commerce, and apps. The company's stock has declined 33% this year through Monday, with sales continuing to fall. Pershing Square USA launched a roadshow for the initial public offering of its common shares. The hedge fund management company is expected to list at $50 a share, and it's seeking to raise $25 billion from that offering. That would make it the largest fund of its kind in the U.S. Pershing Square will apply to list the shares on the New York Stock Exchange under the symbol PSUS. Much of Houston remains without power in Tropical Storm Beryl's wake. Authorities warn that the blackout could last for days. More than 85% of the city lost power, and at least one person was killed after Beryl made landfall yesterday. Most of the outages are in Houston and areas to the southeast, where strong winds and heavy rain knocked out electric lines. The city is now facing threat of high temperatures, with the National Weather Service posting a heat advisory for the region through Wednesday. And that's your brief, John.
Danny, thank you. Up next on the program, AI in the driver's seat.
There's policy fog, but I think there's opportunities for money to work in certain sectors. You got all this demand for AI, these data centers. There's only one country really that can feed this beast, right? This AI beast in a relative way, and that's the United States.
The latest from BlackRock, up next.
Names in tech are on Bloomberg.
I don't like anthropomorphizing AI. I sort of believe it's a tool. It is got intelligence, if you want to give it that as moniker, but it's not the same intelligence that I have.
Especially I'm afraid of whenever it's some kind of AI is speaking for me. I want to be myself, and I want to be the one speaking. I have AI myself. Yeah. Actual intelligence.
This industry of producing intelligence is one of the greatest opportunities I've ever seen. Instead of instruction-driven computing, it's now intention-driven computing.
There's been a lot of us who've been working in AI for a long time. It's great now to see other people using it and seeing what some of the challenges are.
To stay ahead in tech, it has to be much more than just software. So you need long-term investments in science and research.
You have an ecosystem of companies coming together. It's causing a new industrial revolution.
Nobody covers technology like Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
This is Bloomberg News Now.
News when you want it at the touch of a button.
Another volatile day on Wall Street. We're seeing big moves.
All eyes on Capitol Hill as Democrats and Republicans prepare.
Today's job numbers casting doubt on the Fed's next move. Inflation remains front and center. And that's news when you want it with Bloomberg News Now. Get it 24/7 on the Bloomberg Business app, Bloomberg.com, and anywhere you get your podcasts.
Bloomberg News Now. Context changes everything.
Always on the heartbeat of the tech
spread across global markets.
The real-time data aspect is going to be important.
We're going to bring you expert analysis on that. Sure.
Don't miss Bloomberg's interview with the
Let's get you a check of the market. The scores look like this on the S&P 500. Equity futures positive throughout this morning, up by 0.2% as yields bleed a little bit higher, up by 2 basis points. The 10-year just short of 430 at 429.98. Under surveillance this morning, AI in the driver's seat.
There's policy fog, but I think there's opportunities for money to work in certain sectors. You got all this demand for AI, these data centers. There's only one country really that can feed this beast, right? This AI beast in a relative way, and that's the United States. These companies are backing up these valuation with earnings growth, and we see that continuing.
It's the latest. The S&P notching its 35th record high of the year so far as earnings season kicks off this week with big banks. Tech set to report at the end of the month with the AI story very much at the forefront. Wei Li writing this in BlackRock's 2024 mid-year global outlook. We have seen the AI theme drive broader equity returns in the first half of the year. We're sticking with our overweight. Wei joins us around the table. Wei, good morning.
Good morning.
The mid-year outlook's just dropped, I think, a couple of minutes ago, so thanks for coming on straight afterwards with us. Your highest conviction overweight, I think, is Japanese equities. You've maintained this overweight on US equities as well. Let's start with the US, and then we can move over to Japan. Walk me through the US call, what really underpins, what the biggest pillar of that call is.
Absolutely. So we can look at the cyclical factors. If we look at kind of the first half of the year, we have had positive surprises on earnings driven by AI. We had negative surprises on rates driven by Fed repricing. As we look ahead to the second half of the year, maybe we have less negative surprises from rates, maybe even positive as we head into rate cuts, but less positive surprises on earnings just because the bar has risen. But the bigger picture is, which is something that we lay out in the outlook, we got to look beyond the cyclical ebbs and the flows and really focus on the transformations that are happening around us. So AI is driving that, but the low carbon transition is driving that as well. When we add up the CapEx numbers from these transitions, from these transformations, we're talking about magnitudes comparable to the industrial revolutions, comparable to the internet revolutions. So we really think that we're moving from the financial economy to the real economy, and investing needs to change as well. It doesn't mean, given the elevated uncertainty, we need to de-risk. In fact, we need to properly use risk budget to lean into the transformation, but it does mean that we're going to be more selective, be more active, and private market plays a bigger role.
You offered some historical examples. Let's dig into that just a little bit more. Sometimes you can identify the mega force with ease. How easy is it to sort of identify the winners of these mega forces? Just taking the internet as an example. The internet was a big deal, but sometimes it was difficult to identify who would be the ultimate winners of that mega force. How easy is it this time around?
It's hard. It's hard. It's highly uncertain. So if we think about the various forces that are playing out, it actually means that as we look ahead to the future, there is an unprecedentedly wide range of outcomes possible. So no longer can we think about investing around a central base case with deviations around it, but we need to think about it in terms of scenarios that can be very different from each other, that may have very little overlap with each other. So that's how we kind of rethink investing and portfolio construction as a whole. But as we think about kind of identifying winners and losers, because this is an environment that does create more winners and more losers, we need to think about it in sequencing, in stages, right? So phase one of AI is really around AI build out. So this need for energy competition, arms race for energy and data center build out. And phase two is around really kind of the broader adoption, companies building out their AI capacities. We're seeing healthcare already doing that. Phase one and two can both be inflationary because we're talking about creating demand before the benefit on the supply side and productivity side can really come through. Phase three is around productivity boom, but that's hugely uncertain. And it cannot happen if phase one and two does not happen. So it will have to be inflationary first before it can be deflationary. Which is the reason why when you talk about going long high quality bonds, you're talking about short term. Before we get there, before we get to Japan, I know we should get there, but I really want to dig in with the idea of AI being a trade that is very hard to sort of distinguish. You have Citigroup talking about how some of the AI exposed high flyers are probably overbought. We've been hearing the B word, bubble, in say certain stocks like NVIDIA. Does the AI trade include some of those names that have already gotten bid up dramatically? Yes, at the current juncture, yes. So our U.S. equity overweight also include the tech sector overweight, telecommunication, communication services overweight as well. But we are starting to broaden out our kind of AI play as well. So the initial beneficiaries are the likes of Magnificent Seven. And just to note, their earnings have come through. Their earnings have been revised a lot, and they have actually give or take delivered, if not beat expectations. So valuation is
not as stretched as the price appreciation would suggest. But as we think about kind of the phase 2 of AI implementation, as broader sectors starting to adopt AI and benefit from the gain, efficiency gain, we have sectors like financials and healthcare and industrial as well positioned for the AI infrastructure build out. We want to include them in our AI play as well. And if we look at kind of the earnings picture, the last earnings season, we had 8 out of the 11 sectors growing their margins, which is incredible, showing a sign of broadening out. Looking ahead, tech is still expected to lead, but sectors like energy and healthcare are also expected to drive earnings growth in the second half of the year.
Okay, so just a really short bit on Japan. I know that that's your biggest overweight. I wonder how much this is sort of betting on a Bank of Japan rate cutting cycle that isn't necessarily a rate hiking cycle, excuse me, that isn't exactly tightening, but is an adjustment to deal with where the yen's at.
I would say that our Japan core is actually mostly a micro core at this juncture. The macro story, exiting deflationary decades and benefiting kind of from the macro lift, inflation coming back, we have already benefited from that. Now we're looking at companies delivering earnings. Expectations are for Japanese equities to grow earnings by 7-8% in the coming 12 months. We think that they can do better. You look at the latest AGM season, corporate governance, shareholder reform, that's progressing as expected. The currency, we talked about it not that long ago, is somewhat inconvenient because it's so volatile. It has been very, very weak. In part, it's helped earnings upgrades for manufacturing part of the Japanese equity market, but more broadly for foreign investors, it's just so volatile. It's gotten to a point, initially weaker currency was helpful for Japan achieving their inflation targets. Now, as we head into kind of election cycles in Japan as well, both for the party as well as for the country next year, it's less helpful. So I think there will be policy, we're not talking about explicit intervention, but maybe encouraging repatriation of foreign ownership back into Japan, maybe attracting foreign inflows that could help with the currency stabilization.
Well, it's getting tons of inflows now, lots of tourism. The Nikkei up 2% at the close today. We're higher this year, Lisa, by 24.25% on the Nikkei.
Yeah, I do wonder how much tourism is giving them a boom economically. I just know from some discussions.
I'm not sure how happy the Japanese are.
No.
With that boom, and these cities becoming even crowded.
Yeah, Have you seen some of the angry messages? Yeah, please stay out. Stop photographing us living our lives.
They don't want dollar yen at 161 either. Welly of BlackRock Way, congratulations on a new outlook. Thank you very much for joining us. The third hour of Bloomberg Surveillance. Up next.
So what's it like moving from the East Coast, where everything is finance and money, to the West Coast, where everything is technology? Did you fit in right away? And did you really know how to use all the computer things that they give you to use?
So it was pretty fun. There were plenty of times where I would sit around in meetings and literally I would be Googling terms. And at one meeting, Larry Page actually caught me Googling terms, and he kind of pointed that out to other people in the room, which was a little embarrassing, but I figured there were some things that I could do that they couldn't do. And so it was a learning curve. And my dad always, he taught me at a young age a term that I've used constantly with my teams. He said, in his lab at Stanford, if a physicist could not define a quark in under 30 seconds, they didn't know what they were talking about. And so I use the quark test all the time. If somebody's rambling on and they can't get to the point, they probably don't know what they're talking about, they fail the quark test. My finance team knows this quark test. And at Google, I'm working with amazing computer scientists, so they never fail the quark test. They can explain things really clearly, which shoots you up the learning curve.
But did you understand what they were talking about from the beginning, or did you have a special tutor that's taught you technology? Or did you
I had actually run tech banking and took Google Public, so I had a little sneak preview.
It's the world's second largest economy with a growing influence in global affairs. But geopolitical uncertainties, deflationary pressures, and questions about foreign investment linger. Bloomberg, the China Show, brings you the unmatched expertise you need to keep track of breaking news, in-depth market analysis, and the most influential newsmakers in and around China. Bloomberg, the China Show. Weekdays around the world, right here on Bloomberg. Context changes everything. Today's CFOs are reshaping the C-suite. Bloomberg's chief future officer shines a spotlight on these dynamic leaders.
It's an incredibly fun job, for sure.
We're in the business of leading beyond the numbers.
To me, teamwork is key. You need to identify opportunities and push people.
It's not about how to say no, it's about how to say yes.
Their impact goes far beyond the balance sheet. And on Chief Future Officer, they focus on much more than just revenues and margins.
Today's CFO has to be much, much more than a bookkeeper. I talk more about culture today than I talk about numbers.
It's not just about debits and credits and digits and dollar signs.
It's a lot more than the profit today. It's building the future of tomorrow.
Get passion, perspective, and more from the Chief Future Officers of some of the world's most influential companies. New episodes this summer, only on Bloomberg. Brought to you by Workday. From the world of politics to the world of business, every weekday on Bloomberg TV and radio, hosts Joe Matthew and Keely Lines deliver news, insight, and analysis from and about politics' biggest power players.
The president has been clear that is non-negotiable.
I mean, this is going to be an ugly, ugly year.
Balance of Power, live around the world every weekday, only on Bloomberg Television and Radio. Context changes everything.
Has definitely turned a little bit the last month. And I think the key part of that is it's just gotten more broad.
We're not seeing a weakening. We're not seeing a contraction. But this is what drives the economy, and we are seeing a deceleration.
What we're seeing is signs that the consumer is slowing down.
When you look at last quarter's GDP, a little bit lower, a little bit below trend, I think this means we are going to start to see more slowing in GDP and overall spending.
There are key pockets of weakness. This is a lopsided economy.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Jonathan Ferro, Lisa Abramowitz, and Anne-Marie Hordern.
Live from New York City, the third hour of Bloomberg Surveillance begins right now with quite a day ahead. In many ways, the week begins a little bit later this morning. At 10 a.m. Eastern Time, you will hear from Chairman Powell going in front of the Senate Banking Committee, in front of the House Financial Services Committee tomorrow on Capitol Hill. And then at the same time, two screens up at the same time, I think, a little bit later this morning, Chairman Powell on one. On the other one, Lisa, Secretary Yellen testifying to the House.
So there are two issues. Will Fed Chair Jay Powell set up a September rate cut? That is essentially what a lot of people are looking for in terms of his rhetoric and whether he puts a bigger emphasis as for the weakening in the economic data. And then there's a real question about how politics affects this. He's not going to say that. Maybe we're going to hear a little bit from Janet Yellen about some of the political ramifications of some of the issues that we've heard with Joe Biden, with NATO, and a question around just how strong of a leadership the U.S. can have.
And of course, as well, she'll probably be asked about the deficit, but most entirely, she will be asked by the Republican side of the aisle about Joe Biden's health. This is going to be very political for Secretary Yellen, even though she's supposed to be talking about international finance. Andrew Hollenhorst, though, when it comes to the other side of the split screen, he's saying Chair Powell will likely sound incrementally more dovish in congressional testimony this morning after the unemployment rate rose to 4.1% last week. Is this the moment potentially he takes to really set up September?
With good reason. I want to understand how he's going to characterize the unemployment rate. Will he lean on how much it's moved, how much higher it is, the fact that it's going to be above potentially where they forecast it to be by year end? Or will he say that on a historical basis, it's still very low? Because we kind of know what he thinks already about the payrolls number, because he alluded to this in the news conference. He basically said, to some extent, and I'm paraphrasing here, that he thinks perhaps that's overstating the real strength and the gains that we're seeing in the general economy. And then we saw that backed up by the number on Friday anyway, when we saw the revisions to the previous 2 months. So really, for me, it's less about the headline number on payrolls and much more about what he thinks about what is happening with unemployment.
Whether he views this as a window to make an adjustment, and whether you start to see a shift in the rhetoric. You were pointing earlier to what he said last week, John, when he was talking about how they have time. Does he see that they have less time now, at a time when you basically are having a growing number of Wall Street analysts coming out and saying, actually, you know what, this might be the window that they have to really cut rates before it really becomes a pernicious increase in unemployment?
You can see the obvious sequence of things right now, right? You sort of tee it up a little bit today, you talk about it more in July, you go to Jackson Hole, relay out your plans, and then you deliver it in September. Is that too cute Do you think we're being too cute about the path here? Do they have to lay things out that clearly for everyone and give you advance notice over the course of 2-3 months?
No, they don't. And this is the issue, is that they don't from any economic perspective. But on a political perspective, there is this question that Peter Scheer was talking about. If they aren't a little cute about this, where they can basically forecast it now, does it basically set, as he was saying, social media spinning? I mean, basically, does this end up jeopardizing credibility of the Federal Reserve because of the timing if there is some sort of market response and people say, oh, they're just trying to juice the markets ahead of the election?
Well, let's talk about the markets, not the juice part ahead of the election, but the broader part of where we are right now. Equity futures on the S&P 500 positive by 0.2%. Yields up by 2 basis points on a 10-year, 429.59. And in foreign exchange, the euro just a little bit negative here, softer by 0.1%, 108.14. I wonder for the audience out there what you think the biggest market moving event might be, whether it will be the testimony from Chairman Powell later this week or whether it will be the news conference with the president on Thursday. Which one will it be?
I'm obviously looking at the news conference. I think it's really important. This is going to be his moment to potentially quell those concerns. He tried to do it yesterday. I don't think it worked. And yesterday he really was hammering on all cylinders, firing on all cylinders. It was a letter to congressional Democrats. It was an appearance on TV. It was a phone call with donors. And then it was an evening Zoom with the Congressional Black Caucus. And still today you have people, I mean, we just heard from a donor who said behind the scenes, that number we know of is 9 congressional Democrats that are saying he needs to step aside. The number is obviously much bigger. And how bigger is it? And can Thursday really mean the dams are breaking for real?
We know the mood the president's in. Came out swinging yesterday, some choice comments on party officials. The party has spoken. The Dem nominee is me. On donors, I don't care what the millionaires think. We know what mood he's in. The mood of the press is really interesting. And I think you've got an example of that yesterday in that news conference. And I think you're going to see another example of it again on Thursday. We had a conversation earlier this week about career risk of analysts, okay? You have to talk about career risks of journalists, people who've been in that room every single day, very close to this White House, who haven't reported on this. And I know some people have done a good job. I think of Axios, the Wall Street Journal, select names of this institution as well, of course. There are other companies, other institutions that have ignored this for months. And they're the ones that are really fired up right now because they don't want to be the individual that didn't cover this if things get a whole lot worse. And it's the mood of them that I think you got an example of yesterday that you're going to see again on Thursday.
You have people who feel like they have been betrayed, whether it's a cover-up, whether it's this idea that their indication was they should just sort of be quiet about this, it wasn't that serious, when it became very serious at the debate. And that sense of betrayal you're seeing sort of play out in real time.
You're going to see it again on Thursday. Coming up this hour, you might see it this hour too, with Emily Rowland of Jan Hancock, as she talks about stocks hitting fresh record highs. You really won't. Helene Becker of TD Cowen as holiday air travel surpasses records, and Lauren Goodwin of New York Life ahead of Chairman Powell's testimony a little bit later. We begin with our top story. Stocks hitting the 35th record high of the year so far, but Emily Rowland of John Hancock remaining cautious, saying this: if the US economy had a relationship status, it would be it's complicated. Amidst weaker economic readings, we came back to the bad news is good news regime for markets, with everything rallying on these releases. It has been a good run, but bad news is likely to start to mean bad news for markets soon. Emily is with us right now for more. Emily, just walk us through that. I understand the regime we're in at the moment. Bad news, good news. Saw it in the market, saw it in the price last week. Why do you think that's going to change sometime soon?
Well, look, you just look at those June business surveys. They showed vastly different trends for the U.S. economy. The ISM survey on both the manufacturing and services side falling below 50. And meanwhile, you have the S&P version that showed that we're in expansionary territory, both, again, on manufacturing and services. Then you look at things like the jobs report, which you all have been referencing this morning. You saw great on the surface, 206,000 new jobs added, but underneath the surface, massive revisions to the tune of 111,000, and then the unemployment rate jumping to above 4.1%. So the economic data right now are about as clear as mud, but we do see a broad decelerating trend happening, and that's something that investors need to be aware of. Right now, we're celebrating the idea that we're reviving hopes of rate cuts. Now bond markets pricing in 2 cuts for this year, but at some point the Fed's going to be cutting not on a preemptive basis, but because growth is decelerating meaningfully and the labor market is deteriorating.
So, Emily, what are you selling and what are you buying? I mean, is this basically sell the S&P, buy long bonds?
Not necessarily. We continue to see momentum driving markets. We've seen this kind of combination of quality and momentum really taking center stage. We've been overweight quality, overweight U.S. tech stocks, and that's really been important. So I wouldn't say we're overly bearish in this stage. It's funny. I listen to you guys every morning, and it just feels like there's very few bulls out there. Everybody that comes on has kind of a bearish tilt to them. And bear markets don't really start that way. They usually start with a lot of optimism. So we're really not seeing that. There's also a ton of cash on the sidelines right now. Money market assets are sitting at $6 trillion. There's $23 trillion in bank accounts. There's still a lot of dry powder here to keep this market going. We just want to think about participating, but getting a little bit more defensive. In addition to those higher quality options, we're looking at defensive areas like utility stocks. We want to lean into quality at a reasonable price, looking at the value side for stocks and sectors that are trading on sale, areas like healthcare, U.S. mid-cap equities, industrials, which we're seeing as an opportunity here. But of course, that a lot of that's in the price on the equity side, trading at 21 times forward earnings. Bonds are not sniffing this out yet. We started the year at 388 on the 10-year Treasury, sitting at about 430 right now. There is a really nice opportunity here to look at getting paid income as we wait for this potential contraction in economic activity to play out.
We've been talking all morning about sort of the push-pull between weakening economic data and the political backdrop that's been whipsawing bonds. And I want to go there. You think it's a good opportunity to buy long-term bonds at a time where there's a backup and you do have this potential slowdown. How much do political concerns weigh on this, whether it's trade policy, whether it's the deficit?
Yeah, we actually think it's noise on the political side. We tend to underweight political analysis and making cross-asset decisions. It's really difficult to do. We have made mistakes trying to do it in the past, and we found that looking at the economic backdrop, looking at fundamental trends has been far more relevant to portfolios. So to your point, as we've seen these backup in bond yields reflecting some of this political concern and we've seen it globally, we would be looking at those backups opportunistically to start leaning into high quality bonds and again, getting paid that income. We do think inflation's decelerating. We'll obviously find out more this week, but we're looking at things like average hourly earnings falling, used car prices are falling. The shelter component is likely to come down as the housing market starts to cool off a little bit here. All of those things mean that inflation, which was bonds' worst enemy, we think is going to start to be our friend here as we approach the back half of this year.
Emily, are you saying this, it's complicated in terms of the U.S. economy, Fed relationship status, it's complicated plus because of the politics surrounding it? You saying that just you have to look through it?
Not necessarily that you have to look through it, but we're at this point right now where, look, economic data is not bad. And certainly it's great in the U.S. versus the rest of the world on a relative basis. You look at things like initial claims, which to us is one of the best, most timely macro indicators. Yes, they're perking up and a lot's been made of that, but we're still in this range of 200,000 to 260,000 that we've been over the past couple of years here. So really not all that bad. Again, we're still adding jobs. We're looking at an environment in which some of the surveys tell us that economic growth is in expansionary territory. So we just want to be mindful here because there are cracks underneath the surface if you look really closely at the data. And we want to be prepared for an environment where we do see slower economic growth. Look, inflation coming down, it feels great right now. There's nothing better than waking up to the smell of disinflation in the morning. And we'll see if that happens with this latest CPI report, but it's not great for corporate revenues. So as we see corporate profits come down amidst that slowing inflation environment, the cost of capital is still elevated right now. The Fed hasn't cut yet. That means there's likely to be margin compression. And as companies deal with defending those margins, they want to stay profitable. They have to cut costs. Typically, the biggest cost most companies have is labor. So we are looking at the sequence of events, which should ultimately result in the unemployment rate rising. And again, that's an environment where you will get paid owning higher quality bonds.
Emily, thank you. We've got to leave it there. Emily Rowland of John Hancock, looking ahead to the smell of disinflation on Thursday morning. Looking for CPI, headline CPI to come in at 3.1% year over year. Lisa, down from 3.3.
There's nothing better than waking up to the smell of disinflation with, as you mentioned, French oats. I mean, honestly, this to me is
sort of a Brexit theme in financial markets. We're a sad bunch, aren't we?
I think so. And then there, of course, you've got Peter Scheer saying, I don't even know what reality is anymore because everything gets spun by social media.
So let's talk about the deficit.
Look, okay, you don't have to go there again. I know. But it was relevant at the moment, and he actually cares about it. So let's park that for a second. I am curious, though, just how much people are looking through some of this noise. And we heard that now from two people on the show this morning, Kelsey Barrow, and now from Emily Rowland, this idea that this backup in yield is a buying opportunity. Look through everything and just look to the idea that you're getting the smell of disinflation.
Is it noise or is it news? And that's part of the challenge right now. Let's get you an update on stories elsewhere this morning. Here's your Bloomberg Brief with Danny Berger. Hey, Danny.
Hey, John. Donald Trump has said that he hasn't decided yet who will be his vice presidential pick. Speaking to Fox's Sean Hannity, he plans to make an announcement in the coming week. The former president said his running mate would be, quote, a person that can do a fantastic job as president, as well as somebody that helps you get elected, and there's nothing wrong with that. Trump said Senators J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, Tim Scott, and North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum were all under consideration. The lawyer representing Archegos founder Bill Hwang has made his final pitch to a jury. Hwang was accused of being behind a scheme that artificially jacked up stock prices, eventually costing Wall Street banks $10 billion. Hwang's lawyer repeatedly said that the case, quote, makes no sense, and that Archegos experienced a black swan event. The jury's verdict will bring an end to a trial that's lasted 8 weeks and force many to revisit what led to that implosion of Archegos in 2021. Hamad International Airport in Qatar takes the top spot in this year's Air Help survey of the world's best airports. The company creates the rankings partially based on customer feedback, quality of food, and shopping options at 239 airports globally. Punctual arrivals and departures represent 60% of each airport score. Rounding out the top 3 were Cape Town International Airport in South Africa and Chubu Centrar International Airport in Japan. Just one U.S. airport cracked the top 10, and that was Salt Lake City International Airport, which opened in 2020. And that's your brief. John.
Danny, thank you. More from Danny in about 30 minutes' time. Politics is the gift that keeps giving. Just it writes its own jokes. You ask the former president what he wants to see in a running mate, a person that can do a fantastic job as president, somebody that helps you get elected. That's it. That's the only description we've got. That's what we're basing on all this speculation, like who it's going to be in the next week. Someone that helps you get elected.
Right. What is that? And that's going to be the key question.
Baseline.
Yeah, basically. I mean, but at what point is that going to change depending on what happens on the other side?
Well, that's the key point. That is the key point for the next week or so. Up next on this program, the Morning Calls and Helene Becker of TD Cowen as summer travel demand continues to skyrocket. That conversation up next from New York. This is Bloomberg.
Middle East and Africa. Vibrant resources and high-yield investment opportunities abound. Join me on Horizons Middle East and Africa for the stories, newsmakers, and insight from this exciting region. Now weekdays, only on Bloomberg.
From the beating heart of global finance, economics, and politics, and wherever newsmakers are moving markets, Bloomberg brings you conversations that allow for deep discussions and important insights. What do you think the future is for inflation? Is this new normal? Are markets too optimistic? How do you worry about the things that are outside your control? How does the current fighting completely stop? I'm Francine Lacqua, and this is The Pulse, every weekday only on Bloomberg.
Counting it down to the opening bell, 1 hour and 12 minutes away. Equity futures on the S&P 500 in the green and just about positive by 0.2%. Yields are higher on bonds by 2 basis points. The 10-year 429.78. Time now for some morning calls. First up, Piper Sandler upgrading Bank of America to neutral. The analysts no longer seeing a reason for the bank to underperform, expecting net interest income to rise to a stronger level, but the analyst still prefers its peers, Citi and JP Morgan. Next up, Wolf Research downgrading Paramount to underperform on the back of the Skydance takeover deal. The analyst saying that the investment debate is now simplified to whether the media giant can invest profitably in direct-to-consumer products. And finally, Wells Fargo raising its price target on Airbnb to 129, maintaining an underweight rating. The firm highlighting near-term momentum for reservations, but it's less optimistic about margin pressures into next year. That stock is just about positive, 0.1%. Sticking with travel, the TSA screening more than 3 million people on Sunday. Rounding out the July 4th holiday weekend, it's the first time that many passengers have been screened in a single day in the agency's history. 8 of the 10 busiest screening days have come this year as travel demand tops pre-pandemic levels. To discuss this and a whole lot more, Helene Becker of TD Cowen joins us. Helene, let's talk about this. Super busy weekend at a time when Boeing is struggling to build planes and United Airlines, at least their jets, are struggling to hold on to the wheels. Helene, I'm just wondering, are things too busy?
Yeah, thanks for the question, John. Yeah, I mean, we've never seen these kind of travel levels before. The system has proven that it really is having a hard time handling it, especially when there's bad weather and we have huge delays and so on. It just cascades down through the entire network. And so you're seeing bigger planes in general rather than more service because there's only so much that can be done. And we don't often, you and me and Lisa and the team, we always talk about airline traffic. We don't talk about what's happening at the airports. And the airports are having their own issues with lack of parking, with the lack of, in some cases, lack of food options and lack of seating, especially at some of the older airports where people, are asked to come early. And then they have to wait. There's no charging stations in a lot of older airports. The charging stations in newer airports don't work. So, there's this whole ecosystem that was built around a smaller level of population that travels. And now we're seeing so many people travel on a regular basis. To your point, 8 of the 10 busiest days have been this year, and most of them have been in the last 6 weeks.
So do you think that, Helene, this is introducing a problem that is would have been the case even pre-pandemic, or do you think that it's been exacerbated to a big degree because the personnel just isn't there after a lot of the layoffs in 2020, in 2021 that have left a lot of senior people no longer in the workforce?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is yes. I think this level of travel was coming anyway because you have an aging population and you have a lot of people who have more time to travel and they're doing so, right? They're doing a lot of bucket list trips and so on. So you're seeing this huge increase in international travel. For younger people, they got used to traveling with their parents and they want to continue to travel with their own families. So you're seeing a lot of that. But to your point, we were expecting those kind of travel numbers maybe a little bit later in the decade, not so much now. And also all of those people who left, whether they were furloughed or they chose early retirement or they chose other careers in the 2020 to let's say 21, mid 2022 timeframe, the people who have come in to replace them are less experienced. The FAA says we're short about 3,000 air traffic controllers. Congress approved the new budget, which allows for the hiring of more. It also allows a path for those who have been air traffic controllers in the military to come into the network without going through the entire FAA training academy. So there is a way to increase that. But at the busiest airports, the pay scales are still relatively low. So people don't want to do that career. They don't want that job because they have to live within, I think, an hour and a half of their base. It's very expensive to live in the New York area. It's very expensive to live in Chicago area, San Francisco. And so people don't want those jobs. And the result is that we have this limitation on how much capacity can grow, which is should eventually be good for airlines because they should make more money. But for travelers, it means they have to pay more for airline tickets.
Can we talk about what happened yesterday with United, the most recent mishap when it comes to losing its wheel? And John asked the question earlier that was the right one. Do you think this is a United issue, or do you think this is a Boeing issue?
I think it's an issue. I think it's more of a supply chain issue. And I think in this case, it was probably a United issue, not a Boeing issue. Aircraft come out of maintenance. They have to be double checked, triple checked before they go back on the line. This was a case of a wheel falling off. This is not obviously the first time United has had an issue. I don't want to disparage them because they're a safe airline. I fly them a lot. You guys probably fly them a fair amount being in the New York area. So I don't want to say negative things about them, but yeah, I mean, every airline can be good or bad on any given day, and they're just having this issue. And for them, this was a 757, I think, that you're talking about, and that's an older plane that's been around for a very long time with a really good safety record.
Elaine, what do you like right now in the airline sector? Everyone seems to love Delta. Terminal 4 is a mess, just to throw that out again. Elaine, what do you like in the airline sector right now?
Well, Delta actually was our top pick for 2024, so getting thrown under the bus there. But yeah, I think from a balance sheet perspective, from a traffic perspective, growth, opportunity, their big advantage is that only pilots are unionized on property. Everybody else is not union, so they have the ability to make adjustments without going through an entire big process. Unlike the other airlines, if they want to make adjustments, they have to go through the unions. So Delta was our top pick for 2024. I think it still continues to be. We also have buys on United and Alaska Air as other ideas. Copa. I've talked to you guys a lot about Copa in the past. It's one of our favorite names in the mid-cap airline sector. So I think those would be our top 4 or 5.
Elaine, thanks for jumping on for us. Appreciate it. Helene Becker there of TD Cowen. Looking ahead to Delta reporting later this week. Someone around this table flew Delta over the weekend, right, and had some problems at Terminal 4 coming back from the airport.
Is that right?
Yeah, deeply personal.
Does somebody want to talk about said problems?
You were part of the record, though, the TSA screening record.
I'm very proud to be part of the record. I don't know how pleased I am to be part of that Terminal 4 mess, honestly.
But did you get there on time?
Did I get to my destination on time? Oh, yeah, sure.
And did you get back on time?
No, delayed.
Okay.
Technical issue.
All right.
Delayed by about an hour, I think.
Maybe they wanted to make sure the wheel didn't fall off.
And then delayed trying to get, transport back from Terminal 4.
Yeah, well, that's not fair.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
Equity futures on the S&P 500 positive here by 0.1%, elevated across the board on the Nasdaq as well by 0.25%, the 35th all-time high of the year at the close yesterday. The fate of today's price action in the hands of one man, Chairman Powell, and maybe some other stuff too. Get to the bond market. The 2-year, 10-year, 30-year looks like this. The 2-year 463.89, yields up by a single basis point. On the 10-year, up by 2 to 429.59. We've talked a lot about the debt issuance coming up a little bit later. We get $58 billion of 3-year notes, Lisa. Then we get 10s, and the day after that, we get 30s.
Yeah, I was just trying to understand why we suddenly saw a real tick up in yields and why we saw the Russell 2000 go negative, considering the fact that there isn't really anything out there that I can particularly key in. I don't think it is the auctions, since we've known about that for a long time. I do wonder whether you start to see political risk creep into the appetite for the longer duration bonds. We heard that from Peter Scheer. We heard that also on the flip side from the likes of Kelsey Barrow, who say use any of those dips to buy. Do we see that buying activity on a day like today, tomorrow, or Thursday?
Ian Lincoln of BMO said exactly the same thing about this bond market. Want to watch a little bit later. I want to finish on foreign exchange, take a quick sneak peek at what's happening with the euro. Just a quick one, because not much. Euro dollar 108.16. We're negative by not even a 1/10%. Under surveillance this morning, the White House firing back at reports about President Biden's health, including a New York Times story citing multiple visits by neurologists specializing in Parkinson's disease. Biden's doctor releasing a statement last night saying the specialist had only conducted routine exams.
And what they're saying is that the specialist came in also to treat other members of the White House campus, including military members who serve there. The issue is, why were they so delayed on this? You saw that exchange between Karine Jean-Pierre and some of the journalists, and then it was only late last evening that the physician came out with a note. All of this feels like the White House is on the back foot. They're on the back foot on trying to shore up donors and trying to get out to congressional Democrats, individuals who are questioning whether this president needs to step aside, and also on the back foot on quelling these concerns about whether or not the president was treated or consulted with a Parkinson's expert.
I can tell you the tone of that briefing, the appetizer for what's still to come on Thursday. That's the main course.
How much are you going to end up getting? A pretty aggressive press corps. I'm wondering, when you talk about the relationship to markets, what the playbook is if Biden is or isn't the Democratic nominee. If there is a shift in the belief whether he could actually maintain that, how much does the market trade change? Do we have a sense of that at a time where maybe it's noise, call it noise, but the noise happens, and so at some point, some people are going to be making bets on this.
Didn't we get a taste of that 2 Fridays ago, when we started to price in a Donald Trump presidency a little bit more?
If there were a candidate, though, who had a better chance of winning versus Donald Trump, what would the trade be at that point? I just wonder when people start to actually get their head around this. There's one thing when you say Joe Biden looks like a weak candidate and he's going to remain in. That's the Trump trade. What happens if there's another candidate that is a stronger competitor with Donald Trump who would like to see this unfold with Joe Biden being the candidate?
We'd have to get to know the candidate, wouldn't we? If it's Kamala Harris, I wonder how much distance there is, how much daylight there is between the VP and the president at the moment on the same ticket.
It's a great question. I would like to see some notes on that.
I'm sure you would. Write them, I think is what Lisa's saying. Let's talk about Nike. Bringing back a veteran executive to try to fix its sales slump, Tom Petty is set to return as vice president of Marketplace Partners. The sportswear giant is trying to rebuild its relationship with retailers like Foot Locker after pulling products in favor of its own stores and e-commerce operations.
This is actually a really interesting story. During the pandemic, a lot of the big brands, Nike in particular, said, we don't need you, Foot Locker. We don't need you, Loman doesn't exist anymore, but any other store that distributes some of these things. There's this question of, we can go direct to the consumer and we don't have to lose profits in the transaction. Now they're realizing that didn't work. They're trying to lure them back. So they're bringing back a previous executive. I find this quite interesting. How much are they going to bring those relationships back into the fold when they realize that those physical distribution centers are actually incredibly important?
What's old is new. They're bringing back an individual who is in retirement, but likely, to your point, he probably has these relationships that they need to, what the sounds of it, really shore up in a quick way.
Have they got a distribution problem or a design problem?
It's a great question.
I can speak from my own personal perspective on this.
We know what you buy. You've told us all.
Sure, I know where to get Nike from. I don't think they've got a distribution problem. I think they've got a design problem.
Or a relevancy to the people who buy sneakers, which are runners and athletic endeavors. I mean, I do wonder how much this is just basically getting away from some of the bread and butter and counting on Air Jordans to carry them through, and then Air Jordans lose some of their luster, and suddenly the reselling trade doesn't work in the same kind of way, et cetera. And you lose something like, look, I have a personal relationship with this.
I know, which is why I'm smiling.
I know, you're laughing at me, but...
On the side, Lisa trades Jordans.
No, I do not trade Jordans, but at a time that was cool for the kids to do that. It's not anymore.
Okay, let's move on from this story. You can't keep it together. That's the latest on Nike. The latest this morning for the market, it's all about this. All eyes on Capitol Hill at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Fed Chair Jay Powell beginning his two-day congressional testimony in front of the Senate Banking Committee. And Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen speaking to House Financial Services on the same day at the same time. This all ahead of more inflation data this week, including CPI and PPI. With us around a table, waiting patiently and holding it together, is Lauren Goodwin in New York Live alongside Brett Ryan at Deutsche Bank. To the both of you, thanks for being with us. Lauren, I want to start with you. What are you expecting to hear from Chairman Powell in about 90 minutes' time?
I'm not expecting to hear a whole heck of a lot. I think that he's going to toe the line, just do some basic explaining of where the economy's been, where inflation has been. I don't think we're going to get a clear monetary policy signal from him. However, I do believe that we've been getting a clear monetary policy signal from the data. We all know that the Fed cares about price stability, full employment. What we've been seeing, what we've been looking for in terms of signaling a next rate cut are things like stable inflation expectations, inflation moving lower, an unemployment rate breaking 4%. These are factors that have all started to turn in the last couple of months. I think the Fed will want to see one more month confirming that turn, but I expect September's on the table for a first rate cut.
Last week, Chairman Powell said the labour market's strong, and that gives them time. That's a reason to wait. Do you share that view, that analysis?
The labour market is strong. But the real reason why the Fed has the opportunity to wait is because financial conditions in the market have been easy, because stocks have been well-behaved, credit spreads have been well-behaved, and the reality for the job market is that in 9 out of the last 10 recessions, the economy was adding jobs until we were already there. And so the labor market tells us all kinds of things about where the economy has been, not where we're going. And so I believe that that financial condition easiness, it allows the Fed to be patient, but it could turn on a dime.
Lauren, it's fascinating to me, and Brett, I'd love you to weigh in on this idea that it seems to be getting clearer and clearer where the economy is going for a growing number of at least our guests. Today, a number of people have come on and said, if you look at just the unemployment rate, if you look at inflation, the signals are clear. Do you agree?
Well, I think from the chair's perspective, the growth data and the latest labor market data would say that they're more confident that they're restrictive, right? We came from a 3.5% growth in the back half of last year. We're now tracking about 1.5, a little bit over 1.5 for the first half of this year. We're seeing payroll growth slow. But I think to the point of what Powell's going to be talking about, what we saw in Central last week was him emphasizing all of the dovish points. This is a strong labor market, not because hiring's strong, but because layoffs and discharges are low. And so the question is, how long is that going to last? With inflation, though, I think the message has been clear. We need to see more better prints. This week's data should show a bit of a rebound. The weakness in last month's CPI report was really all due to airfares as well as motor vehicle insurance. So, they need to see rents starting to move back down to get sustainably to 2%. So they're not there yet. But that said, Powell had said an unexpected slowing of the labor market would be a reason to move earlier. So, our base case remains that December is going to be the first cut, but the door is definitely wide open, to Lauren's point, on September.
Brett, what would you have to hear in today and tomorrow's testimony from Jay Powell to change your call to be September from December?
So what was interesting in what he phrased, how he phrased the recent inflation data at Central last week was that he compared the May, April, and prints to the first quarter of the year. And he said, May was a step in the right direction. April was not as good, but still better than Q1. But April was actually worse than the February print. And to me, it sounded like, okay, for Powell's starting point for how many good prints we need to see, April was sort of his starting point. April, May, so if you're thinking to yourself, okay, how many more prints do they need to see? 3, 4. It seemed from the way Powell phrased it, which was a little awkward, but deliberate, that his starting point was the April print. And so maybe, that to me speaks to he really wants to get a cut on the board soon. It just comes down to whether inflation data give it to him, and he has a committee that goes along with it.
Do you think the election matters? Do you think Canada matters, and that date in November circled in red?
Right. So I think the election matters in the sense that one of the big unknowns here is the fiscal outlook. Now, arguably, from a deficit standpoint, it's going to be the same. But when you have extreme differences in terms of policies such as tariffs, inflationary, and then, I think that could cause a little bit of caution because you really don't know how that's going to shake out. You can get a sweep one way or the other, and the fiscal outlook could change in a more inflationary direction. So that's another reason to kind of, stay the course for now, unless you're forced to. Don't give up the policy space. By the way, that you've gotten to over 5% yields, which nobody thought was possible 5 years ago. Wait as long as you can. Obviously, you don't want to wait too long, as Powell's emphasized, and there are those little warning signs there.
But if they're trying to potentially look apolitical, you wouldn't want to cut right before the election, which would be September. And if April you think is maybe his starting point, why aren't more people talking about July then?
Yeah, they haven't been. I mean, it'd be a lot to signal right now, and I don't think he has a committee that's willing to go there just yet. But to your point about September, without a strong labor market story, cutting on an inflation story alone, it may why give the appearance even if there isn't. Certainly the Fed is not political. They're going to do what's right for them. But what's right for the economy. But at the same time, I think it's going to take either a sharply slowing growth story or an unexpected, as Powell talked about, an unexpected, drawdown in the labor market.
One thing we've discussed on this program repeatedly is that not all cuts are created equally. There's two very different kinds of rate cuts. One is a fine-tuning off the back of some disinflation with a positive economic backdrop. The other is a labour market that's breaking and something they have to respond to and really put the emphasis on the other side of their dual mandate. Lauren, you've said repeatedly that this market can thrive up and until when this labour market really starts to crack. And a question we've been asking on this programme is how close we are to that danger zone with unemployment through 4 and claims starting to creep a little bit higher. Do you sit here and say that on a historical basis these are still very, very low levels, or do you look at the change, the rate of change and the time we've had that change in and start to say we're getting close to that danger zone?
For the market signal, you look at where we've been most recently. The reality, from my perspective, that any impending slowdown or even recession is likely to be mild is sort of besides the point when it comes to a market transition. And so what we're looking for market concern about a turnaround in the labor market are things like the SOM rule. Right now, we would need to see 4.23% instead of the 4.1 where we are. Again, or jobless claims moving higher considerably. Neither of these things have been really moving in that direction so far. And so for investors, that can be tactical. This is a market that we still see as fairly constructive until those labor market indicators or earnings expectations really start to turn the corner. We believe the equity market rally can continue to trudge higher.
This is sort of the confusion with the way that the market has rallied. But it hasn't been all names, right? It's been a number of names that have kind of led the charge in a pretty significant way. Isn't this market already positioned for some sort of significant slowdown? Isn't that the base case of what we're seeing in the Russell 2000 and the equal weight S&P?
I challenge that position. I'm sympathetic to the position, but I challenge that position a bit because we really haven't seen more than a couple of days of pullback over the course of this market. And so while there is a divergence, not just in particular equity names and sectors, but also in the health of the consumer. Really depends where you sit on the income spectrum. We're still looking at a corporate environment overall, a consumer environment overall that are relatively healthy. And in order to see a true reset in investor expectations, we typically need to see an equity market revaluation of about 20%. And in the names that haven't been trudging higher, we haven't seen a revaluation of anywhere near that level. And so I anticipate that until economic activity really shows signs of slowdown, we haven't seen that reset yet.
Get a taste of everything. CPI on Thursday, and we get the earnings kicking off on Friday. Bank earnings just around the corner. Lauren Goodwin of New York Life, Brett Ryan of Deutsche Bank, to the two of you. Thanks for being with us. Massive week ahead. Kicks off with Chairman Powell a little bit later this morning, testifying in front of the Senate Banking Committee at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Let's get you an update on stories elsewhere this morning with your Bloomberg Brief. Here's Danny Berger. Hey, Danny.
Hey, John. A quick check on BP shares in London, falling by 4 1/3% after warning of weaker oil refining and write-downs. BP sees significantly lower refining margins and says it will take up to $2 billion in impairments in the second quarter. The figure includes charges related to scaling back refining operations in Germany due to high costs and declining fuel demand. Pershing Square USA has launched a roadshow for the initial public offering of its common shares. The hedge fund management company is expected to list its IPO at $50 per share, and it's seeking to raise $25 from the listing. That could make it the largest fund of its kind in the U.S. Pershing Square will apply to list on the New York Stock Exchange under the symbol PSUS. And Aramco is looking to raise at least $3 billion from its first bond sale in 3 years. That, according to people familiar with the plan. Meetings with fixed income investors are expected to start today. The offering, debt with 10, 30, and 40-year maturities. The final size could be larger depending on investor demand. And that's your Bloomberg Brief. John.
Danny, thanks for this morning. Appreciate it. Up next on the program, setting you up for the day ahead. You're watching Bloomberg Surveillance live from New York City. This is Bloomberg.
You're a famous photographer, you're a conservationist, you're an activist. How would you define yourself?
I think I'm just a human trying to figure out how to be a better steward of our little planet. I am a biochemical engineer by training. I studied marine biology, fisheries, aquaculture, and then I realized that the ocean is very much out of sight and it needs help. And so I became a photographer to be able to communicate with a larger audience. And thank goodness I was good at it.
When did you realize that actually photography was your passion and you could make a real difference to our world?
You know, I didn't start out as being a photographer, so it was not until 1990-something, 96, when I picked up a camera, and I became a professional photographer soon after. And it's one of those things that it's like learning another language. You learn a few words, and then you put a few sentences together, and one day, you might be able to write poetry.
This is Bloomberg.
So a couple of times this morning, Danny's joined the program and she's broken down this list of the top airports in the world. Is that right?
Yeah.
Top airports in the world, top 10?
Yeah.
Where is JFK on that list?
You know, it's a good question. I
Still
can't
looking?
seem to find it. It's not on there.
What's the worst airport on the planet?
It's in Tunisia.
Okay.
I've been to both then, the top and the worst.
Yeah, well,
You've been to that airport?
Yes.
Is it that bad?
Honestly, I don't really remember it being that bad.
Well, I guess it's a matter.
They didn't have a lot of extras. All right, so you go to the airport in Doha, and there's everything. There's even Ralph Lauren coffee.
Okay.
There's not a lot of extras at the Tunis
It's
airport.
basically like a hangar. You walk through and you get
Fly
a
in
plane.
and fly out.
Okay, all right. That's all you need. That's all you need. All right. Equity futures on the S&P 500 positive by 0.1%. Going into the opening bell about 41 minutes away. Lisa's still looking at this list. I can see you doing it. Looking at the bond market, yields are higher by a single basis point. Focus, Bramo. 429.39 on the US 10-year. Counting it down to the opening bell. Here's the trading diary for the rest of this week. It is absolutely stacked. At 10 a.m. Eastern Time, we'll get Fed Chair Jay Powell beginning his two-day congressional testimony in front of the Senate. At the same time, you'll hear from Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen speaking before the House. Tomorrow, more Fed speak from Goolsbee, Bowman and Cook. On Thursday, US CPI plus another round of jobless claims. We'll also get Delta earnings too. On Friday, US PPI and unmatched plus JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, Citi, all kicking off big bank earnings. With us around the table, I'm pleased to say, is Michael McKee to get us ready for what we're about to hear in about 1 hour and 10 minutes. Michael McKee, what are you focused on?
Tempelhof, that was a bad airport.
That was a bad airport.
Now. That was a bad airport.
All right.
Okay. From Jay Powell.
What people want to actually talk about.
And by the way, JFK is 113th.
That makes sense.
Jay Powell is probably not going to give us a whole lot today. There are two categories, or well, we could say three categories of issues for him. One is monetary policy. He's going to say the same things that he has said. We are committed to the 2% inflation target. We have more to do, and we will think about cutting rates before we get to 2, but when we feel there's confidence that it's going to continue going down. The second aspect is bank regulation. He got the last Humphrey Hawkins testimonies were almost completely taken up by bank regulation questions from both the Senate and the House. So we'll probably get a lot on that today. And then, tomorrow maybe more so with the House, but there are always some political questions. And I'm sure that however you wrap them up, it's either, do you support Joe Biden or do you support Donald Trump? And he will say, I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole.
There is this issue, and we've been talking about it all morning with all of the guests that we've had on surveillance, which is, will his tone be different this week than in Sintra, given the jobs report, given some of the data that indicates that unemployment is rising and inflation is coming down?
Well, that's going to be the debate after it's over, was how dovish was he? Did he shade one way or another? But they have been talking about paying more attention to unemployment and the other half of their mandate in recent weeks, over the last couple of meetings even. So it wouldn't be new news. It's really what the market is looking for, is some sort of thing to hang their hat on in terms of when we get a rate cut. And probably he's somewhat constrained by the fact that the CPI comes out on Thursday when he's done talking. So why go out at the end of the plank and maybe fall off if you don't have to, if there's more data coming?
Representative Andy Barr said yesterday to reporters, though, that a September rate hike, quote, will not be perceived as apolitical. If Powell is thinking about potentially there is a cut before the election, doesn't he need to do some work today and tomorrow to make sure that he is preparing at least the political voices in D.C. for that to potentially happen?
I don't think he needs to do it today or tomorrow. He can make it clear that the Fed will do what it feels it needs to do when it feels it needs to do it, and that they are not influenced by politics. But I think when they get the problem is you can't say anything on Capitol Hill that doesn't go straight into the newspapers. And so he doesn't want to do that and let people start speculating, because you're going to get a lot of market volatility once the markets start to think that it's coming. But he does, remember, spend a lot of time talking to individual members of Congress, and that's the kind of thing that maybe if he trusts somebody, he can go off the record and he's not going to say we're going to do it, but say we're getting closer.
Can you just give me some insight on this? Because this morning we got the NFIB small business optimism come in actually stronger than expected at the highest level this year. Why isn't this being talked about as sort of highlighting that this is still an economy that has quite a bit of steam behind it?
it depends on whom you're talking to. There are people on both sides on Wall Street. There are people who say that the economy is doing fine, and the Fed is sort of along with them, saying we don't need to move now because we're not in trouble. And then, of course, the doom crew has been saying we are about to go into recession 6 months ago. And so he's going to balance those two things. But the narrative, in part because it's a political year too, is what's wrong. That tends to be the journalist view. I mean, you don't get a lot of stories on the front page saying everything is wine and roses.
10 a.m., what will you be watching? Chairman Powell or Secretary Yellen? If you had to pick one.
Oh, I'd be watching Chairman Powell because he can have a direct influence. What'll be interesting from Yellen is any talk about what their debt policy is going to be. We have auctions this week, and that's going to be important to a sector of the bond market. But the overall impression of the economy and the overall idea about what we do about interest rates will come from Jay Powell.
We know what Lisa's watching at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Mike McKee, thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Coming up tomorrow, Brian Levitt of Invesco, Dan Skelly of Morgan Stanley, Lisa Coleman of JP Morgan, Steve Englander of Standard Chartered. That's your lineup for tomorrow. Just some final thoughts around the table going into Chairman Powell later this morning.
Buy the dip on political noise.
Yeah.
Which dip? And that, I think, is the most interesting aspect as people look to some of the disruptions in markets and what they think is noise and what they don't.
You did the week ahead, but honestly, we missed, I think, what is the biggest event, which is Biden and the need for him to perform Thursday evening. He needs to be like the Biden of early 2022, when he did that record, nearly 2-hour-long news conference and took questions from everyone in the room, things he wasn't even prepared for. He cannot just come out and take 2 to 4 questions. That's not going to cut it.
Will this be a news conference on NATO or a news conference on the president's health? What's this going to be a news conference on?
The questions will start with something about NATO and the U.S. looking strong, and how can we look strong if people...
All of that still to come this week. It kicks off with Chairman Powell a little bit later this morning, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, in front of the Senate, then in front of the House tomorrow. Then we get CPI data on Thursday morning. Then on Friday, we start to get earnings. We can talk about what's coming from the likes of JP Morgan, the likes of Citi, and look ahead to Goldman and Morgan Stanley into the next week as well.
That might actually be potentially the most market-moving event if they signal some sort of weakness, if people basically are looking for that.
That does it for us. Look out for our colleagues at the top of the hour, Shnali Bassa, Cody Gradford, Matt Miller, with Bloomberg Open Interest. That program about 4 minutes away from New York City. That does it for us. This was Bloomberg Surveillance.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
We're operating in a very volatile environment. So JetBlue has a very large presence here in New York, and there are air traffic control challenges. And so we've had to overinvest in hiring excess crew members and building flexibility into our planning process. And so over time, we hope to wean some of those investments back as the operating environment around us stabilizes.
We made the decision early on that we were only going to invest internally on key differentiating technologies, and clearly the powertrain is the key differentiating technology. So our investment is a recurring investment with respect to the powertrain team, the battery team, which is part of it, the engine team, electric engine team, which is part of it. And we also have a lot of non-recurring costs with the other components because we're not developing those internally. We're using the existing aerospace defense supplier base for most of the other components.
We invest a lot in the offices, that you feel home, that you can actually be at your best yourself, and people work very differently. We take a lot of input from the sports world, actually, the athlete spirit, right? Building a sports team that can perform at the best, but also talking a lot about the explorer spirit. How can we really tap into new things, continue being disruptive? We have 80 different nationalities at On. It's very important to have a diverse team because we have a very diverse landscape of customers.
The names that move markets are on Bloomberg.
How worried are you about the U.S. election? It's for the American people to decide what they want with their politics, with their government, with their future. But obviously, we are all concerned about it because the United States is the largest economy, the largest defense country in the world, and has been a beacon of democracy with all its upside and downside. We cannot interfere with their choice. It's their choice, and that's the beauty of democracy. But we have to be extremely attentive and anticipate, just as we do with inflation. You know, we do scenarios. What if, what if, what if? Then what do we do? Where I sit now in Frankfurt, head of the ECB, I think that we have to be strong as Europeans and not assume that we can rely on whoever our friends are around the world, because these things change over the course of time, as we have seen.
Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Stocks are set to scale yet another all-time high, less than 30 minutes until the start of trading. I'm Matt Miller.
I'm Shanali Basak.
And I'm Katie Greifeld. Bloomberg Open Interest starts right now.
Coming up, Powell in the spotlight. It's day one for the Fed chair as he testifies before lawmakers who are growing impatient for interest rate cuts.
And NATO leaders gather in Washington as a defiant Biden battles infighting about his presidential campaign.
And Citi says it's time to book profits on your AI bets. Even though that rally shows little signs of stalling, they say that the gains in some names is, quote, concerning. Let's take a look at where markets are trading right now. About 30 minutes until the opening bell. We have another rally on our hands. The S&P 500 up about 0.2% in the pre-market. Saw its 35th record close this year yesterday. We'll see if today is number 36. It's a similar story if you take a look at big tech. The NASDAQ 100 currently up about 0.3%. A tiny bit of a sell-off in the bond market. Matt, currently yields on the 10-year up about 1 basis point.
Maybe we're seeing record high after record high because financial conditions are so loose. Of course, the Fed wants its policy to be restrictive, and here you see the blue line showing Fed rates holding high, and yet financial conditions continue to loosen. So that's why we hit record high after record high.
And there's some stocks I'm watching as well into the pre-market, because speaking of record highs, you have Intel pre-market set to rise for a fifth day, its longest winning streak since January. Remember, this is a stock still down 32% this year, but it does just go to show that the latest rally in chip makers has some traction. Intel up pre-market about 2.9%. Also watching Boeing taking a little bit of a lift here, but roughly flat on the day. Remember, just a day ago, United said another one of its aircraft lost a wheel while taking off from LA. Remember, Boeing also in talks to preserve government contracts in the United States after agreeing to plead guilty to a criminal charge put forth by the Justice Department. We'll give you updates as we get them.
All right, let's hope we don't lose a wheel on day 2 of our new show. Open its debut yesterday, and there's not much less news today. I mean, it's been incredibly busy for a July launch.
Incredibly busy. Of course, we have Jerome Powell taking the spotlight today. We'll count you down to that one. But if you think about day one, I thought it went pretty well. I mean, we had Howard Marks, we had Greg Jensen, and of course, we had Mike Wilson, Shanali.
We have another all-star lineup today. Of course, Lori Calvasino joining us from RBC, Torsten Slok. There's so much to unpack here between the equity market and the bond market, particularly before 2 hours of Powell testimony.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get to what Mike Wilson told us yesterday about the chances of a market correction.
I think the chance of a 10% correction is highly likely sometime between now and the election, not just because of the election, but because uncertainty is going to prevail for a lot of different reasons. Earnings reasons, election outcome reasons, some of the things you mentioned earlier around tariffs, potentially immigration, Fed policy still remains uncertain. So yeah, I think the third quarter typically is that period, and it's going to be choppy.
Now, since he said that, I think a lot more people have been worried. Yesterday, I read Julian Emanuel pointing out that the road to his 6,000 target is going to be bumpy. Let's bring in Lori Calvasina right now, head of U.S. equity strategy at RBC Capital Markets. Lori raised her year-end forecast for the S&P 500 to 5,700 from 5,300. Lori, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for joining us on the inaugural week of our program. What do you think about, what seem like worries about these new highs that we're hitting day in and day out?
So look, I'm admittedly in the pothole camp, as I like to call it. I'm getting a little tired of the correction, pullback, NOMR. But the reality is that I do think we might go a little bit higher before we hit that pothole, and that's what we tried to reflect with our target increase last week. If you think about some of the reasons to be worried, I agree with a lot of what Mike said. Seasonality, if you look especially the past 5-10 years, we tend to run into trouble August, September, or October. If you look at the election, usually there's some sort of uptick in the VIX in presidential election years. We haven't really seen that yet. And then also, if you think about what's happening economically, we're seeing consumer sentiment take these hits. It really seems, I'm not in the recession camp by any stretch. I want to make that clear. But we are hitting a soft patch, and the City Economic Surprise Indicator has really taken a pretty big hit in here. So it feels like the right time for the market to take a breather. That being said, I've noticed a lot of people are starting to call for that as well. And admittedly, I'm in that camp. But sometimes when that happens, it ends up being more like a 5% drawdown than a 10% drawdown.
It's interesting. At the same time, you have sky-high expectations for earnings season, and whether you're Goldman or Evercore, there's a lot of thinking here that perhaps a lot of this is already baked in. So how much risk is there this earnings season?
So I will say on earnings, I actually nudged my number up from 237 to 242, and I think the consensus is around like 246 bottom up. One thing I will tell you as a strategist, I have really learned that we have to give some respect to the bottom-up consensus estimates. Bloomberg Intelligence does a fantastic job of tracking those bottom-up consensus estimates. Thanks. And they do. I mean, they've got some of the best data on the street on that. And, what we're seeing right now, there hasn't been too much movement in those recently. They are really baked on the idea that margins are going to continue to expand, so we do have to be mindful of that. But what I will tell you is if you go back and you look since 2009, where the estimates are around mid-year, June or July, that is pretty much where they end up at the end of the year. So strategists like me can come in and run their models and fight, and say, oh, that's a crazy assumption. The reality is I feel like I've learned to really give these management teams the benefit of the doubt to manage through for a couple quarters. They keep showing us, especially since 2018, especially on the margin side, that they are able to do that.
Let's talk about the management at some of the smaller companies in corporate America, because small caps, it feels like they just can't get off the ground. I've heard a lot of people tell me that, okay, the Fed is going to cut rates, so buy small caps now. You want to get ahead of that. Then you take a look at the Russell 2000, and it has just badly lagged the S&P 500. What's going on with those small names?
So if you look at, we can't really look at this on the Russell 2000. That's a whole tangent we don't want to get into right now. But if you look at the S&P 600 and the downward revisions to this year's earnings estimates that have been in place for basically the past year, it's pretty much in line with the median drawdown, the median downward revision. The S&P is kind of flat versus last summer, right? So there's a resilience in the bigger cap companies. The smaller cap companies are not able to replicate. They just don't have as many levers to pull in terms of cost management, whether it's addressing labor, input costs. They're just not able to defend their margins as well. So I think that's part of it. I think the other thing that's happening with small caps is we all just need to stop overthinking it. If you look historically, small caps versus large around rate cuts, they don't tend to pre-trade them. They tend to wait until you actually get the cuts in place, and frankly, sometimes even lag the cuts a little bit and then start outperforming. And so if we think the Fed's not going to cut, to September or December is our RBC house view, it's a little too early to do it right now, especially at the same time that economic expectations really aren't moving up anymore. Right. We've lost the economic tailwinds, and we've got this Fed headwind that's still in place, and you've got an earnings headwind.
But Lori, aren't markets these fantastic forward-looking vehicles that are supposed to price things in advance? Why would that small cap trade actually maybe lag the rate cut?
So historically, it just hasn't happened that way, and I think it's because the balance sheets, any metric you can pull up, first of all, small caps, their balance sheets are better than they have been in the past, but they're still much worse than large caps, right? So they are bearing the brunt of that impact. But also, let's just think about practically what's happened over the last year. We had a fierce rally in November and December in small caps. Every hedge fund I talked to was trying to go long small caps, pre-trading their Fed cut bets. Then we get into January and we dial down those Fed expectations. So when I hear those same hedge funds trying to make these long small cap arguments, I'm like, you guys already did this once and it didn't work and you got burned. So I think the fact that that community got burned once is going to make them a little bit more reticent to pre-trade it. Now that being said, I don't want to be underweight in here. Relative valuations are cheap. And if you look at the CFTC positioning, we're down around SVB low. So I think you want to watch that inflection. But there's no reason to be a hero here. People have already gotten their heads lopped off once by trying to do that.
Speaking of heads being lopped off, you have S&P 500 on track to potentially hit a 36th high today, a 36th record. How do you hedge your positioning from here? Is that perhaps the more important trade?
So I'll tell you what I'm looking at right now with S&P is and with all this stuff that's going on election-wise, and I think, look, there's just a lot of fog out there, right, in terms of what it means for the U.S., but I do think we've seen a little bit of momentum for Trump since the debate. I do watch the betting markets. I know that's very controversial, but what I have found is that if you look at the Trump-Biden spread in betting markets, looking at the RCP average, and you look at it against U.S. relative to Europe, what we're finding is that when Trump has the momentum, U.S. is outperforming Europe. And when Biden is bouncing back, that's when we start to see Europe bounce back relative to the U.S. So I feel like there's fog on both sides right now, you know, in terms of looking at Europe, what all the results there mean, what exactly is going on here. But the one thing we know is Trump seems to be coming out of this with a little bit of momentum, and that's resulting in a buy the U.S. trade.
All right, Lori, hang tight for a minute. We want to take a quick look at markets. We're going to get right back to you. We are, in terms of futures, continuing to see gains on the S&P, continuing to see gains on the NASDAQ. And, you know, yesterday we closed out the S&P at 55.72, as Shanali mentioned, a 35th record high. If we finish even a little bit higher today, that'll be a 36th record heading into Jerome Powell's testimony. Everybody is going to be watching for any hint that the Fed chair is looking to cut rates, and we'll bring it all to you live. This is Bloomberg.
In tech are on Bloomberg.
I don't like anthropomorphizing AI. I sort of believe it's a tool. It is got intelligence, if you want to give it that as, you know, moniker, but it's not the same intelligence that I have.
I especially am afraid of whenever it's some kind of AI is speaking for me. I want to be myself, and I want to be the one speaking. I have AI myself. Yeah. Actual intelligence.
This industry of producing intelligence is one of the greatest opportunities I've ever seen. Instead of instruction-driven computing, it's now intention-driven computing.
There's been a lot of us who've been working in AI for a long time. It's great now to see other people using it and seeing what some of the challenges are.
To stay ahead in tech, it has to be much more than just software. So you need long-term investments in science and research.
You have an ecosystem of companies coming together. It's causing a new industrial revolution.
Nobody covers technology like Bloomberg. Context changes everything. In a multi-trillion-dollar industry, there's a lot of ground to cover.
Bitcoin ETFs rubbing elbows with the big dogs.
This frenzy has engulfed the entire world.
We'll show you what's happening in ETFs like no one else. Bloomberg ETF IQ, only on Bloomberg.
Now now to high interest to look at what's making headlines around the world. President Biden has won support from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and other Democratic progressives who previously criticized him. The mood seems to be shifting against calls for him to step aside. He allowed his physician to share health details to quell concerns. The doctor says Biden only saw a neurologist for annual physicals and that he's not being treated for Parkinson's disease. Most of Houston remains without power in the wake of Tropical Storm Beryl. Authorities warn that the blackout may last for days. The storm flooded streets, downed trees, darkened traffic lights, and left power lines on the ground. 3 deaths were linked to the Category 1 hurricane so far. And Fed Chair Jerome Powell begins 2 days of congressional testimony today at 10 a.m. It's his last scheduled address to lawmakers before the election. He'll likely have to defend the higher for longer policy stance and the Fed's claim to be independent, especially ahead of a possible Trump regime in the White House. For more on what to expect from Powell, let me go over to Katie.
Yeah, definitely of high interest, of course, anything that Powell has to say. So let's get to it right now with Michael McKee. He is Bloomberg Chief Economics and Policy Correspondent. What are we expecting to hear from the Fed chair?
Well, there are probably 3 categories that Jay Powell will be addressing today. One is the state of monetary policy, and he'll talk about how the Fed is committed to its 2% target. They don't have enough confidence to start cutting rates, but they will do so when it is necessary. Basically the same stuff that we have been hearing, because he doesn't want to go out on a limb with CPI coming out on Thursday that could change everybody's perception of what monetary policy should be. There will also probably be a lot on banking regulation. That's what we got at the last Humphrey Hawkins testimonies, both in the House and Senate. Senators and congressmen wanting to know how tough the Fed is going to be on Wall Street. Powell last time said they were planning some major overhauls of the regulations. We'll see if there's been any progress. And finally, as Matt said, the question of Fed independence and the question of what happens politically going forward. Republicans, Democrats will try to get Powell to wrap himself in their flags, and he will probably say, we are independent, we're going to remain independent, and we don't want to get involved in any political discussions.
Mike McKee, we thank you so very much. We're looking forward to catching up with you later, closer to the Fed's testimony. But meanwhile, strategists at Citigroup out with a note this morning saying that now might be the time to take profits from some of the biggest names in AI. And yesterday's trade suggests that the AI rally actually might be now broadening out, with Corning, Supermicro, and Intel ending as some of the biggest gainers on the day. And we spoke with Greg Jensen of Bridgewater about how they're playing the AI trade.
Big productivity miracles are pretty separate from economic cycles. So when you look at what we're doing in Pure Alpha, we're generally trying to make sure we don't have too much exposure to whether the productivity miracle works out or not. So when we trade U.S. equities, we trade them kind of with AI hedged.
Lori Calvasina of RBC Capital Markets still with us, and curious, Lori, about how you feel about this Citi call, this idea that maybe we're not in a bubble here, but maybe that it's time to take profits in those high flyers.
So I sympathize with the impulse. I'm not sure I'm quite on board with the timing. And in terms of why I sympathize with the impulse, if you look at the top 10 market cap names in the S&P, I think they're trading around like 27, 28 times forward earnings now. We've seen them get as high as 29.8. That's really close to the ceiling of about 30, 31 times that we've seen post-COVID. So they're having trouble breaking through past highs. If you also look at the CFTC data on NASDAQ 100 futures positioning as sort of a proxy for positioning in this trade, it's basically, you know, kind of starting to move back to past highs. It hit them, moved down. It's looking pretty elevated. So I get the impulse. I think the problem is in terms of timing. I think you really have to see the earnings prowess proved of the rest of the market. If you look again, I'll go back to some Bloomberg intelligence data they put out every week, but if you look at the Mag 7 versus the rest of the market, the gap in earnings growth has gone from about 40% in 2023 on actuals. It is shrinking, so the rest of the market is expected to catch up while that Mag 7 cohort decelerates. The gap is sort of stuck around like 2-3% for 2025, and we haven't seen any movement in that. So it feels to me like the seeds are there. It's not getting the proper sort of water, sunlight, nutrition. I think the other thing, frankly, GDP forecasts for next year are stuck around to 1.8%. To really get back into the value cyclical part of the market, to see that broadening out, we need GDP above average, and average is around 2.5%, 2.6%, or we at least need it to move up the way it was late last year, and it's just sort of stuck. So I get it. I think we should be vigilant, but I'm just not quite sure now is the time.
You know, we all know the market is concentrated, but I think it's interesting to see how that bears out in terms of earnings, right? You mentioned the BI data. I was looking at Torsten Slok's notes. He's going to come on later. He points out that the top 10 companies in the S&P 500 make up 35% of the market cap, but only 23% of the earnings. So his interpretation is the market must be super bullish on their earnings. We know that's true. But also the converse, the market is pretty bearish on the 490, right, in terms of earnings.
But, you know, it is and it isn't. Like, if you look at the rest of the market, again, going back to that BI data, I think there was like minus 5-ish% earnings growth in 2023. And so it's already expected to rebound into really healthy territory this year and next year. And I think next year it's getting into kind of like the mid to low teens. So there's already a recovery that is baked in. The problem is just the understanding of how powerful that recovery in the rest of the market isn't improving, right? And this is one thing I've learned on Wall Street over the years. It's not just about levels, it's about momentum, it's about trend, it's about things getting better and continuing to move on that curve. And we're not pushing that curve. And again, I go back to the GDP data. I think the rest of the market is a bit more cyclical. And if we're not sort of seeing those cyclical headwinds strengthen and they're starting to weaken a little bit, I'm sitting here as a strategist wondering, how am I going to get, you know, let's call it 12% earnings growth in the rest of the market expected for next? How is that going to keep getting better? It's not. It's stagnating. I think it's stagnating because our understanding of where the economy is headed is stagnating.
Well, on the topic of concentration, and to bring it back to the Citi note, they did concede that not owning or betting against AI would, quote, be difficult for many on the buy side. So you think about just how top-heavy this market is. It feels like you, at a certain level, can't fight it, that you kind of have to just embrace it and go with it.
I think you also just have to wait for it to shift. And like, I know we want to forecast every single little move in the market, but I do think, you know, one trade that made sense earlier this year was when we saw utility flows suddenly pick up. That last reporting season, the utility companies all said, hey, we're going to get a boost from AI because of the boost to power demand. That wasn't priced in. That was a cheap sector. It made sense for money to suddenly move there and start chasing it. So I think those are some trades we can look for. But just to sit here and say, you know, it's time to short these things, it's time to just go all in on the other side, I think you want to be a little bit more careful than that.
You've underlined the fact that you're not expecting a recession, right? Even though you don't see GDP really coming back to normal. I wonder how much of a concern commercial real estate is, because I keep seeing, you know, vacancy rates remain high. It's not like more people are coming back to the office, even as more people are getting jobs and, you know, the economy is growing some. We're headed towards a wall of maturity as the Fed is holding at 5% and change. I mean, it seems like a recipe for disaster, especially considering the great financial crisis came down because of other real estate concerns. Right?
I think it's, you know, it's something that comes up a lot in our meetings, comes up at conferences as well. You know, it's something we certainly pay attention to, whether we're looking at REITs or banks when we're reading through transcripts. And here are the two things I've been telling people is, number one, there are so many eyes on this problem, whether you're talking about investors, regulators, or the media. We're all watching it. We're all, you know, really trying. I think that gives me some comfort, frankly. This is very different from the housing bubble, right? When there was just denial, denial, denial. I used to go to those crowded home building conferences and just hear, you know, lies coming out of companies' mouths, right? And everybody would sort of, you know, get frustrated, but half the people were in the room were buying what they were selling. That's not what we're in right now. We're all heavily scrutinizing this. The other thing that I feel like we're starting to understand is this is part of the new post-COVID normal. Where simply work from home, not being in the office 5 days a week, that is just sort of around to stay in some shape or form. And I think that this sort of commercial real estate headwind, it's a slow-moving train wreck, right? I think that it is being dealt with. It is still a concern. It is still causing some problems, but it's moving slowly enough people are able to manage the fallout.
Well, that's a reassuring note to end it on. Lori, it's always great to see you. Really appreciate your time today. Our thanks, of course, to Lori Calvasina of RBC Capital Markets. Now, coming up, we're going to take a look at the companies making the most social buzz today in our Social Climber segment, up next. This is Bloomberg.
East and Africa. Vibrant resources and high-yield investment opportunities abound. Join me on Horizons Middle East and Africa for the stories, newsmakers, and insight from this exciting region. Now weekdays, only on Bloomberg.
What happened was you were offered a money-losing women's basketball team, and you said, I want to be in the other sports as well. Is that right?
Well, yeah, you know, you got to be smart about this.
Bloomberg covers the world with unmatched reach and resources. From more than 120 countries, the moment news breaks, 24 hours a day. Bloomberg, context changes everything.
All right, it's time now for Social Climbers. A look at the companies making waves on social media this morning. And first up, big trouble in big oil, with BP saying it expects significantly lower refining margins. The energy giant also predicts a write-down on the value of a German plant of up to $2 billion. That, of course, is the latest in a string of impairment hits and lower profit announcements in that sector. Next up, we have Helen of Troy losing an epic earnings battle. The maker of Hydro Flax, Vicks Vapor Rub, and Dry Bar products, it announced that profit and revenue will actually fell well below expectations. Now, the consumer products company also slashed its full-year outlook thanks to weakness in its beauty and wellness brands, rather. And finally, we have Disney unveiling plans to launch a new cruise ship that will set sail from Tokyo starting in 2028. Disney has plans to launch 3 more ships, including one that will set sail from Singapore later this year. The cruise line expansion comes as the industry is enjoying a rebound from the pandemic, even though, take a look at shares, well, that's Disney. Disney shares just about flat. You can follow all the latest company buzz on TREN Go on your Bloomberg terminal. But Matt, let's take a quick check on these markets. We are minutes away from the opening bell.
Yeah, absolutely. We're looking at gains again in terms of futures. S&P got an all-time high again yesterday. Of course, the 35th record high, and today, if we close any higher, it'll be the 36th. The Russell 2000 futures, so small caps, are down, but not really significant. 0.1%. It's really all about the big tech companies, obviously. That's why you see NASDAQ 100 futures higher.
But it's interesting because you see the Russell still kind of weak here, even when you see U.S. small business optimism really rising for a third month. It's a high for this year. The reason that's interesting is it's because inflation expectations are coming down. Let's see if Jay Powell has the same to say.
But Lori had such an interesting point on the small caps that even though the temptation is to get ahead of the rate cuts, get ahead of that trade, that actually take a look at small caps and that rally really tends to lag.
I wanted to ask about cruises. You guys, does either one of you cruise?
Absolutely not.
No, right?
Keep me away from the
But
ocean.
I have, and I don't either, but I have heard that Disney has like the best ships.
Yeah.
That's what I've, high service.
You do have
high
2
quality
children
service.
now to take them just
Yeah.
there.
It's
Anyways,
an
coming up, we're going to talk to Torsten Slok of Apollo. He's going to talk about what he's expecting from Powell today. This is Bloomberg.
We're operating in a very volatile environment. So JetBlue has a very large presence here in New York, and there are air traffic control challenges. And so we've had to overinvest in hiring excess crew members and building flexibility into our planning process. And so over time, we hope to wean some of those investments back as the operating environment around us stabilizes.
We made the decision early on that we were only going to invest internally on key differentiating technologies, and clearly the powertrain is the key differentiating technology. So our investment is a recurring investment with respect to the powertrain team, the battery team, which is part of it, the engine team, electric engine team, which is part of it. And we also have a lot of non-recurring costs with the other components because we're not developing those internally. We're using the existing aerospace defense supplier base for most of the other components.
We invest a lot in the offices, that you feel home, that you can actually be at your best yourself, and people work very differently. We take a lot of input from the sports world, actually, the athlete spirit, right? Building a sports team that can perform at the best, but also talking a lot about the explorer spirit. How can we really tap into new things, continue being disruptive? We have 80 different nationalities at On. It's very important to have a diverse team because we have a very diverse landscape of customers.
Bloomberg Surveillance covers the latest in global markets and the political events that influence your world. Join Jonathan Farrell, Lisa Abramowitz, and Anne-Marie Hordern only on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
All right, moments away from the start of trading on the New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ. I'm Matt Miller. This is Bloomberg Open Interest. Take a look at futures. We're up again today, even after Mike Wilson said on this show yesterday we could be down about 10%. An all-time record high yesterday. If we finish up today, it'll be an all-time record high for the S&P as well. There you hear the bell ringing at the New York Stock Exchange. Genworth Financial celebrating the 20th anniversary of their listing there. And on the NASDAQ market site, Chicago Innovations ringing the bell. Let's go over to Katie Greifeld right now and see which stocks are moving right at the start of trading. Katie?
Yeah, one stock I'm keeping an eye on at the open is Nike. You have the sneaker giant taking a senior executive out of retirement to help with their slumping sales. Of course, we got a pretty ugly earnings report from them a couple weeks ago. The stock is down 33% year to date. You can see Sonali right now currently up about 0.4%.
Katie, I'm also keeping an eye on Boeing, fluctuating a little bit pre-market here. Remember, yesterday, United said another one of its aircraft lost a wheel while taking off from L.A. Boeing is also in talks to preserve U.S. government contracts after agreeing to plead guilty to a criminal charge put forth by the Department of Justice. Boeing now down about 0.25%.
All right, Intel, also a stock we're watching, gaining for a fifth straight day this morning. There's been a lot of talk, especially after that Citi note, about broadening out your AI investments. And there's some technical or optionality involved in this. Let's get a closer look at Intel with Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle. Abby?
Well, as you mentioned, Matt, we do have Intel up for a fifth day in a row. Over the last 5 days, up more than 10%. The best 5 days going back to November of last year. So investors liking Intel up 2.8% this morning. You were just mentioning the option action because from a fundamental standpoint, there's not a lot of new news except for the possibility of what you were talking about, a catch-up trade. If we go into the Bloomberg terminal and take a look at what's happening for options, we have an absolute surge here in call buying, suggesting that that some investors think the stock will go higher. What could that be? Well, AI. They, of course, have struggled with some of their more traditional businesses, the foundry. The AI has been off to a slow start. If we take a look at a chart of Intel relative to the stocks and NVIDIA, take a look at NVIDIA up almost 160% on the year. The stocks up about 30%. There is Intel down more than 30%. A beautiful catch-up trade if Intel can put up results. Investors right now betting they can.
Yeah, we'll see, of course, if Intel can actually pull it off. Abigail Doolittle, thank you so much. Meanwhile, markets will also be keeping an eye on Jerome Powell's testimony starting in about 30 minutes' time. And joining us now to help preview, I'm thrilled to say we have Torsten Slok. He is Apollo's chief economist joining us on set. It's great to see you, Torsten.
Thanks for having me.
So let's talk about Jerome Powell because he's made very clear that he would like to cut rates. The data so far hasn't been quite cooperating with that impulse, but maybe a little bit of weakness in the last couple prints. Where do you think he stands right now?
Well, I think for him today, the reality is that we still have 3 inflation prints before the 18th of September FOMC meeting. So that means that he doesn't need to come out with a strong view in either direction. It's pretty clear that they will not cut in July. And it is quite fascinating how the market always says, oh, it's not this meeting, but the next meeting is when the cut will come. So I still think we have some time here for at least 2 or 3 more inflation prints before we find out if the Fed has enough confidence in inflation actually moving down towards 2%.
Why do you think no cut in July? Peter Cheer of Academy Securities was on earlier, and he said he thinks it'll be in July. It's the last day of July, right? Because the Fed doesn't want to cut too close to the election.
Well, I think there's a number of challenges with that view, namely, first of all, if you look at the weekly Red Book retail sales data, is still very strong. If you look at auto sales monthly data, also very strong. If you look at some of the numbers that have been coming in across the board on CapEx spending, on AI earnings, and when it comes to the value of stocks going up, the tailwind to the economy from easy financial conditions is also very strong. So I think that for the Fed, the issue is they need to get inflation to come down towards 2%. And we'll see on Thursday what we get on CPI. But the question is whether they will have that confidence at the end of July. And I still think it's questionable. If this is the case, they definitely need to change their communication sooner rather than later.
If I type ECSU on the Bloomberg terminal, I see economic surprises, and they're all to the downside. And I read your notes every day. You've mentioned commercial real estate recently and the fact that vacancy rates continue to remain high. I was talking about this with Lori Calvasina. And there's a maturity wall coming due. You know, isn't the Fed worried about tripping us into a recession?
I think they are, but from their chairs, they will probably say, well, we need to raise interest rates to make it more difficult to get financing for consumers and for firms and in commercial real estate. And if you look at the progress of this process of the Fed having raised rates since March of 2022, we're just still not quite there yet. If you look at the employment report last Friday, for the last 3 months, employment growth has been 200,000. For the last 6 months, 200,000. For the last 12 months, 200,000. Yes, the unemployment rate is going up, but a very important reason why the unemployment rate is going up is not because people are getting fired. It's because more people are showing up at the labor force, most likely immigrants and others, that are basically saying, well, we would like to have a job. That's a good sign of the economy actually doing reasonably well. So I still think that overall, yes, that process of destroying demand as a result of rates going up is playing out in certain parts of the economy, including commercial real estate. But when you look at the aggregate impact with 206,000 jobs created in the month of June, that's still an economy that's doing quite well.
Torsten, even though you have a Fed chair who will meet Congress, who maybe wants rate cuts sooner rather than later, you still have a situation where the monetary seems to be fighting the fiscal. How much concern is there that if they were to cut rates and the government keeps spending as it is, then the problem compounds into 2025?
Well, when interest rates go up, of course, interest expenses for the government will go up. It will take a little bit of time, but it will eventually happen. But when interest rates go up, you also have that people who live on fixed income and people who own fixed income, including people who own public credit, private credit, will get cash flows that are higher than they basically have been in decades. Combining that with the stock market going up every day, with home prices going up, the wealth of a significant part of consumers, the wealth effect is just really still quite strong. So yes, interest rates going up is biting certainly harder on highly levered companies, on highly levered consumers, and also on some parts of commercial real estate, to Matt's point. But I still think that the net effect still tells you that job growth is still strong. And yes, again, the unemployment rate is going up, but the rise in jobless claims has also been more seasonal. So we don't see this as any sign that the economy really is slowing down to the same degree that the narrative at the moment is in markets.
I'd really be curious about your view on the demand for T-bills as issuance has been really flooding the market. When does demand evaporate and why?
Yeah, this is really important because there has been a very deliberate decision, of course, to issue more T-bills over the last several quarters. And ultimately, debt levels are growing so significantly that we will need to see more issuance of coupons, being bonds and notes. So the more issuance of T-bills rises, of course, it begins to create the question, who is going to buy all these T-bills that are coming to the market? And that begins to raise some issues and fears about what happened in September 2019, where funding markets started to be impacted because there was a significant amount of supply coming to the market. At the time, there was also a lot of issues, well, where supply was so big that created, in particular in the front end of the curve, issues with supply being high. So yes, the change in the structure of debt outstanding is a very important topic in rates markets at the moment.
But when it comes to T-bills and T-bills demand, you've made the case in your notes that once the Fed starts cutting rates, that some of that demand is going to dry up. And I would just want to meditate a little bit longer on why. Because you take a look at money market funds right now, over $6 trillion in there. Is a 25 basis point cut and then maybe another really going to really meaningfully shrink demand there?
That's a good point. And I think fair enough. It's probably not going to shrink demand dramatically, but given the Fed is so keen on continuously telling us that the next move in rates is lower, that means that there's a lot of people that are then thinking about, okay, maybe I should be buying some duration. But what about the front end? If the next move is lower and we'll get a number of more cuts, then that could begin to have some implications for what will happen to the amount of money in money market funds. And the other thing in that discussion is, remember also, what really is intriguing at the moment is that the amount of money in money market funds is going up, and at the same time, the stock market is going up. So we have a very bullish environment where all assets, both the safest asset, namely T-bills, and also the stock market is going up simply because there's still a lot of money slushing around buying investments, both in risky assets and in safe assets.
I have a viewer writing into the question. I happen to know that he's a bond trader. He's asking, when does the market price out euphoria over a cut for the realization that cuts always signify something breaking in the market?
Well, a very important part of that discussion is, of course, what we've seen in the last few weeks is that with the election coming up, there's a lot of debate about what would the implications be for tariffs, what would the implications be for restrictions on immigration, what would the implications be for the amount of T-bills, and what might even be the restrictions be on in terms of, are we going to get a bigger fiscal deficit or a smaller fiscal deficit? So when it comes to the outlook for rates, it is partly the cyclical discussion, meaning inflation, unemployment, jobless claims, but there's also this whole new theme emerging of, does the fiscal position matter? Does it matter that we have more T-bills outstanding, and what are then the implications for the shape of the curve? And the most likely scenario to that question is that we'll probably have a steeper curve at the end of the day if the Fed does eventually start to cut, and we still have some fiscal challenges that are very difficult to deal with, no matter who wins in November.
All right, Torsten, really appreciate you dropping by for our inaugural week. Torsten Slok there of Apollo. Coming up, the 75th NATO summit is set to kick off in our nation's capital with a lot of uncertainty surrounding it, certainly surrounding the president. We'll have the details for you next. This is Bloomberg.
We invest in, buy, and own the backbone of the global economy. When the water gets delivered to your house, the road you drive on, the pipeline that brings different things to your community, the telecom towers that transmit your phone, the data center, the real estate that you live in. It's what we own and build, so it's really what drives the economy, and you don't often see our name.
Is that a good or a bad thing?
You know, it's just because we're behind the scenes, but it's big, with $1 trillion of assets almost. We're behind a lot of the things of the global economy.
So being low-key, do you think it gives you strength?
We just try to be quiet and do our thing, and sometimes it helps and sometimes it doesn't. But I'd say on balance, it's been good for us.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
This is Bloomberg.
DOJ or other authorities.
Could face bigger challenges next.
Fed was going to keep rate World Cup. This is a 3
as the economic picture
covering the intersections of Hollywood, Silicon Valley, and beyond.
is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Open Interest. Let's get you a quick check at what's going on in terms of stocks right now after hitting a 35th record high on the S&P 500 this year. In yesterday's session, we are up again today. You can see 55.84, the level on the S&P 500. The NASDAQ climbing a little bit more than a third of 1% at 20,514. The tech stocks obviously continue to power this rally, even though Citi said maybe take some profits in the high flyers. The Russell 2000, the small caps, down about 1/3 of 1%.
All right, let's get now to some of our top calls. The analyst action that's in focus this morning. And first up, Piper Sandler upgrading Bank of America to neutral. The analyst predicting an uptick in its net interest income after a trough in the second quarter. Of course, we'll get those results in the coming week or so. Next up, TD Cowen raising its price target on Netflix to $775. The analyst cites optimism over membership trends. Now, this move comes ahead of the streaming giant's second quarter results out next week. And finally, we have KeyBank coming out with positive calls on chip stocks. The analyst also raising NVIDIA's price target to $180 thanks to robust generative AI demand. Definitely have heard that one before.
All right, uncertainty is clouding NATO's summit in Washington. President Biden's health, along with domestic elections in France and Germany, are creating headwinds for the alliance. Joining us now with more is Anne-Marie Jourdain, Bloomberg's chief political correspondent, as well as co-host of Bloomberg Surveillance. So, Anne-Marie, my big question is how many of these leaders are coming over worried about the President Biden they saw in the debate, worried about the President Biden they saw on the ABC interview, and wondering if they're not talking to a lame duck?
Well, take it a step back, worrying about the President Biden that some of them also interacted with. They're part of the G7 summit, because we had reporting prior to the debate that there were concerns about individuals in the room, other leaders in the room, other teams in the room, Sherpas, watching the president about how he was really interactive and on it when it came to discussions about Ukraine, but then would sort of zone out when it was some other issues. So this has been a concern, I would say, even prior to the debate for some of these countries. But not only is it going to be overshadowed by Biden and the domestic issues he's facing at home, but you named France. Emmanuel Macron, he comes with his power diluted. Olaf Scholz had a reckoning at the European parliamentary elections. A lot of this summit is going to be about NATO. You had members of the far-right group in Germany actually decide that they're not going to sit through Zelensky's latest speech recently to the Bundestag. So this is a number of these countries coming here dealing with a tremendous amount of domestic issues that's going to overshadow this entire event.
Overshadowing the event and also these early stages of the election cycle, can you give us an update here on how the Democratic Party is becoming more and more split on the issue of Biden?
There's a schism for sure. I think you have 9 congressional Democrats by either telling Bloomberg off record or finding out from calls that they're saying that they want him to step aside, or publicly coming out and saying it, like we heard from Representative Smith yesterday on CNN, thinking that he says there's another individual that should be able to bring the Democratic message more clearly forward. Do these calls grow? Potentially they do. Senators are going to be behind closed doors today. Potentially you hear more about more people coming out and saying he should step aside. But Biden tried to do everything he could yesterday. Many are saying it was delayed, but he went on MSNBC. He wrote a letter to congressional Democrats. He called donors up. And in the evening, he Zoomed with the Congressional Black Caucus. Will this be enough? Thursday is really seen as this test. The White House, jokingly, with our own reporter Justin Sink, is calling it a big boy press conference. He really can't take just 2 to 4 questions. He needs to really be able to field questions from the press on Thursday to show that he is capable of being the nominee, not just being the nominee, but leading for the next 4 years.
So a lot of focus, of course, on that Thursday press conference, a lot of focus on anything he does at NATO. But of course, this NATO summit, it's happening, 4 months to go until the election. And if Trump gets another presidential term, I mean, what could that mean for the future of NATO?
Well, that's why there's some consternation amongst NATO members. You hear people talking about they're trying to Trump-proof NATO. But if you look at some of the facts, Trump wanted GDP of all these countries to be 2%, which they're either at or getting much closer to. He also fortified some eastern flank countries. But the rhetoric sometimes unnerves them, even if some of the actions didn't unnerve them if they were members of the group. And obviously, this is most important for Zelensky. He had told me last week he's not expecting a formal invitation to be into the alliance, but he wants to see that strong commitment from NATO that they're going to be there for basically security guarantees of his country.
But your point, I mean, it's an important one, right? Before Donald Trump was in the White House, these people weren't paying anything for their defense, for what we were doing. And now, I mean, Germany, for example, the biggest economy in Europe, was paying almost nothing into NATO.
Yes, but partially Germany's massive U-turn, was it so much rhetoric from the former president, or was the fact that there was a war now on their soil? I would say it was probably the latter.
Anne-Marie, we thank you so much for being here. Day 2 of Bloomberg Open Interest. That is, of course, Anne-Marie Hordern, host of Bloomberg Surveillance. And coming up next, Pershing Square starts its roadshow for what could be the largest fund of its kind in the country. That and more on our Wall Street Beat up next. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
Get your fixed income fix. Watch Bloomberg Real Yield every Friday right here on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Welcome back to Bloomberg Open Interest. Let's take a check on the stock market right now. You can see the S&P 500 building on that momentum, on its gains. Of course, yesterday was the 35th straight record high. Maybe we'll see lucky number 36 today. Big tech powering the way, up about 0.4% on that NASDAQ 100. And the small caps, they are your biggest loser today. The Russell 2000 currently down about 0.2%, I would say, Shonali.
And Katie, it's time now for the Wall Street Beat. We're going to get to the most talked about stories in finance. First up, an inside look into how Bobby Jane pulled off one of the biggest hedge fund launches earlier this month, of course, in history. There is a most read story here on the Bloomberg terminal by Bloomberg's Hema Parmar, really detailing how he brought people on board here. And of course, this is pretty unprecedented with the scale he's launching at. Of course, in a multi-strategy hedge fund boom that's been waning a little bit, but of course, bringing in still $1 billion from the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority in a more than $5 billion launch.
Yeah, so most hedge funds, I gather from reading Hema's reporting, start small and then grow. Right. And Jane's idea was, we're going to do it all at once on the same day, launch multiple strategies across, $3 billion that he's raised.
The pitch he's making here is that you have a hedge fund that is avoiding the costs, the complexities, if it took longer to build.
Right. No, I get the logic there that you're avoiding duplication. Hopefully, maybe this is a cheaper way to do it in the long run. Can we talk a little bit about how much he actually raised? Because $5.2 billion nothing to sneeze at, but it's not $10 billion.
It's not $10 billion, and he had to do fee cuts to really get there. Of course, this massive charm offensive. Fun fact about Bobby Jane, though, you guys will enjoy. He was really a pioneer here in some of the big strategies in arbitrage we know today, in index options, for example, and index rebalancing. Well, actually, back at Credit Suisse.
Ah, I see. And so he had led this charm offensive, what, from the breakers in Palm Beach?
Hopefully, maybe we'll perch outside there next, guys. But there's another story I want to talk about.
Another sort of fee-cutting story, in a sense, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk about Pershing Square because it has started its roadshow for the IPO of a U.S. closed-end vehicle. It could be the largest fund of its kind here in the United States. And to Matt's point here, it is something that also provides investors here with a lower-cost alternative, doesn't it, Katie?
Yeah, absolutely. So this U.S. Structure, it would have a 2% management fee. He actually has a closed-end fund that's listed in Europe. That one charges a 1.5% annual management fee, as well as a 16% performance fee, which might go a long way to explaining why it trades at that discount. Because it's a closed-end fund, it's at a 22% discount. It's going to be really fascinating to see how this one actually trades with that lower fee. Maybe it won't see quite the dramatic discount that we see in the European version.
But it's interesting how massive his aspirations are. I mean, I know Bobby Jane wanted to go 10, and he only got basically to 5 and change. But Ackman wants to go 25 billion in a closed-end fund. And you showed me a story this morning that reported about all the U.S. closed-end funds only being worth 250 billion. So he wants to raise one that's a 10th of the entire U.S. business.
Absolutely fascinating. And to Katie's point a little earlier to us, this is more than double the size of the fund that's already listed abroad. Remember, this is all part of a grander plan that Bill Ackman has to eventually take his hedge fund firm public.
You know, it's, of course, $25 billion. That would be enormous. We'll see if he can get there. But $10 billion in the Europe vehicle is pretty impressive. This is something I've talked about at length with Matt Levine, for example. You think about sort of Ackman's name brand in the U.S. and the fact that this will also appeal to retail investors as well. You think about Ackman's social media presence, and I don't know, we'll see if it gets to $25 billion, but he does have more of a brand when it comes to the U.S.
Some details of the filing today. The IPO price expected to be $50 per common share. It will list on the New York Stock Exchange under the symbol PSUS. Citigroup, UBS, Bank of America, Jefferies, all just part of a larger group of underwriters.
Like 20
here.
banks are helping him raise it. I mean, you've got to have a lot of banks for that much money.
Guys. Yeah. Everybody's involved.
And I know we have time to just mention that his buddy Boaz Weinstein has waged somewhat of a campaign against some closed-end funds that have underperformed.
Not his Europe vehicle, mostly just BlackRock.
Which is also at a discount, as you point out.
Yeah.
All right, really interesting stuff indeed. Let's get to the trading diary right now, what you need to be watching this week. Obviously, today, you're going to want to stick with us here on Bloomberg Television. Watch Fed Chair Powell delivering his semi-annual testimony on Capitol Hill. That kicks off at the top of the hour. Plus, later, we'll hear from Michelle Bowman from the Fed, and she has made some very interesting comments, I think, about immigration and its effect on the labor market. On Thursday, we're going to get CPI. That's after the 2 days of Humphrey Hawkins, because Powell speaks in front of the Senate tomorrow. On Friday, we get a kickoff of earnings season from the banks. JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, and Citi will all show us what they got in Q2. Coming up in the next hour, Constance Hunter, Macro Policy Perspectives Senior Advisor, joins us as we hear from Fed Chair Jay Powell. She'll help us preview the testimony. This is Bloomberg.
Arch has laid plenty of groundwork for future revenue, but for now, Mark Messler's most pressing challenge as CFO is conserving capital.
You have to have the short-term discipline to sort of circle the wagons around cash. I mean, cash is oxygen. I know where every ounce of cash is going, and but we also have to be nimble around that as well because things change by the day.
Archer went public in 2021 in a reverse merger with a SPAC, Ken Moelis's Atlas Crest Investments. Through August 2023, the company raised over $1 billion from investors including Stellantis, Boeing, United Airlines, and Cathie Wood's ARK Investment Management.
Does that ARK investment open doors for you to bring in different kinds of institutional money going forward?
It does. I mean, I think there's a lot of credibility that comes in with an investor like ARK. As I think about, my top targeted list of investors over the next 2 to 3 years, an investment like that gives us some credibility and gives us a little bit of staying power as I go in and talk to other investors.
With the SPAC pipe now closed, Archer's facing a new phase of raising capital.
I know the folks who aren't willing to invest right now may have large pockets of investment in the future. So I want to be in front of them. I'm wanting to show them progress. I want to create credibility with them that we are marching towards our goals of commercialization.
This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney.
The real outperformance has been the U.S. corporate high yield.
Are the companies lean enough? Have they trimmed all the fat?
The semiconductor business is a really cyclical business.
Breaking market headlines and corporate news from across the globe.
Do investors like the M&A that we've seen?
These are two big-time blue-chip companies.
The window between the peak and cut changing super fast.
Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
Good Tuesday morning from the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio in New York City to our worldwide audience. Alex Steele, Paul Sweeney, we're with you here. Bloomberg Intelligence. We'll drive this conversation forward. We're also out there on YouTube, so head over to youtube.com and search Bloomberg Podcast. Getting some news, red headlines out over the Bloomberg terminal. Fed Chairman Jay Powell says inflation is not the only risk we face. Says the labor market is strong but not overheated. And more good data would boost confidence on inflation. So we're starting to get some comments out there.
This feels, if you're going to do a spectrum, this feels like it would be considered more on the dovish spectrum. Maybe. We did have S&P making another high of the day, right? So we're not overheated anymore. And the idea that inflation is not the only risk we face begs the question, what's the risk? Which probably is growth. So therefore, if growth is a risk, then you cut.
That's right. So we'll see that right now we got the S&P up about 12 points, the Dow off 130 points, and NASDAQ up about 78 points. Coming up, the majority of this program, next couple hours, we will bring you commentary from Fed Chairman Jay Powell as he addresses the Senate Banking Committee. That'll start in a matter of moments, and when it does, we will bring that to you. But first, let's kick everything off here with Mr. John Tucker. John, what do you have?
All right, Alex, well, let's go right to Treasuries, the more policy-reactive two-year yield. Further reaction there, and it's unchanged. I'll call it 463 right now, the two-year,
That's
the
the
10-year.
Bloomberg view we give you.
Yeah, it's
fair.
It's like, so I guess we'll have to wait for Q&A to get some real reaction in the markets. The 10-year 1 basis point higher, that's at 429. Overall, the stocks are mixed. Can we make it 36? S&P 500 is higher. After seeing its 35th record close yesterday. Best performing industry group in the index belongs to communication services. Best performing individual stocks right now, Super Microcomputer, NVIDIA, and Micron Technology. And as we get ready for testimony from Jay Powell in a few minutes, Peter Scheer, the head of macro strategy at Academy Security, says the Fed should cut rates this month, July, to avoid the appearance of playing politics.
Clearly, if they cut in September, say stocks rally 3-5%, you will see the Trump campaign aggressively go after the Fed, blame them for playing favorites. It won't be the case, but the reality doesn't mean anything anymore, right? It's how these things play out in the social media narrative is what's important.
And also Intel shares, they are rising up 0.2%. It'll extend gains to a 5th consecutive session if this keeps up. And also Nikola, let me do those shares right now. The electric truck maker up 0.6%. Alternative energy truck maker, I should say. They reported wholesaling 72 of its Class 8 hydrogen fuel cell trucks. As I read this, I have no idea what this means during the second quarter. Anyway, Nikola shares, they are up 0.4%. Overall, the S&P 500 up 14 points. That's up 0.25%. Record there, 55.86. The Dow down 141 points. NASDAQ 100 is 83 points higher. That is up 0.4%. We check the markets for you all day long, right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker. I guess it means there's more interest in their hydrogen fuel cell trucks in the second quarter.
Yeah,
okay, we'll leave it at that.
Yeah. I mean, you knew. You didn't need help.
No,
you got it.
I did need help.
Tuck knows the things. All right, Alex Steele with Paul Sweeney and John Tucker. We're waiting for Fed Chair Jay Powell to take the seat in front of the Senate Banking Committee. In the meantime, let's get some market movers here. Abigail Doodle is joining us. All right, what is front and center for you? There was a call from Citi about selling some of the top flyers in the AI space.
Yeah, and it's not really taking much of it's not really having much of an influence. We have NVIDIA up 3.7% now, up about 160% on the year. Now, that is still off of its highs because at the highs a few weeks ago, this stock had been up about 180% on the year. But it seems as though investors want back in on this trade. We also have the likes of Broadcom and Micron higher, Super Microcomputer, I believe John Tucker was just talking about. So investors not really believing that. They would probably need to see more than an analyst call to not want in on this big AI rally, and instead are going with the momentum trade, which, you know, from an investment standpoint, Paul, I think from back in the day, you know, that's a lot. People, you would hear a lot of managers saying they would much rather buy strength than not. So that's what's happening here because it's been working. When the music stops, it will be ugly as people rush for chairs. We just don't know when that is.
You know, and it's interesting. I think it's going to come. It could come. You know, we start hearing from these tech companies and they start giving out their guidance. And we've said this probably for the last 4 or 5 quarters that the expectations are very high. The bar is very high for these companies. But by and large, they've met it in each of the last 4 or 5 quarters. Yep. And you know that quarter is going to come when they're not. And is it going to be enough to kind of topple this thing over and give you that 7, 8, 10% correction in the market?
Well, what's interesting is in terms of these big tech companies and just speaking broadly about NVIDIA, and NVIDIA, of course, has been blowing it out of the water in the way that these other companies have not, with massive double-digit growth, both in their guide and their beats. But Microsoft, Apple, Meta, they went a number of quarters ago, single-digit growth, both top and bottom line. The most recent couple of quarters, Meta in particular is coming to mind, Microsoft also, but you know, stronger growth, double-digit, like teen, low 20s. If, to your point, if it some point goes back down into the single-digit, yeah, that could be a real issue for sure for the tech trade. But right now, we're not really seeing any signs of that. The NASDAQ 100 up a lot on the year. The SOX up more than 30%. So investors pretty robust in tech.
Well, here is what Bank of America said, which I feel like nicely encapsulates it. It says that consensus expects a 34% increase in hyperscaler CapEx in 2024, about $200 billion. The question is whether they're going to continue to invest aggressively, even if monetization is pushed out. So as long as they're investing heavily, there's no reason then why the recipients of that money won't continue to make money. But if they push it out, that's where you sort of get the wobbling. I thought that was a pretty interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah, that's interesting. And that reminds me of the need to have versus the nice to have in terms of IT spending overall. If there are any signs of an IT spending slowdown, that's going to be an issue. And I think a few weeks ago, I think that there have been a couple isolated cases of that, but we have not seen that yet. So right now, it seems as though the spending for IT is relatively healthy. Although I will say there has been a little bit of a trend. It'll be interesting to watch this in the upcoming earnings quarter, where companies are taking traditional IT spending, and instead of putting it towards some of the traditional companies, I'm using Cisco as an example, not as an actual for the AI. That means that money that could go to Cisco and some of the old school tech, quote unquote, is going toward AI and creating a little bit of an imbalance.
All right, Abigail, thank you so much for joining us. As always, Abigail Doodle, she covers all the markets for Bloomberg Television and Radio. Market Drivers today is brought to you by Interactive Brokers Bond Marketplace. Access their vast selection of over 1 million global fixed income securities with no markups or built-in spreads and low, transparent commissions. Learn more at ibkr.com/bonds. I see some, they are active in the Senate in that Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee, and we'll go to that in just moments when Fed Chairman Jay Powell begins speaking. We have Sherrod Brown right now speaking. He is the chairman of that committee. Let's go to Ira Jersey, Chief U.S. Interest Rate Strategist for Bloomberg Intelligence. Ira, we got some headlines crossing kind of the Bloomberg terminal. Still focused on inflation. Fed Chairman Powell saying making some progress, but we're going to be continuing to monitor it. What do you think we're going to hear today?
Yeah, so the prepared remarks were unremarkable, basically in line with what the minutes were.
I thought they were well
last
written.
Week.
I don't know.
Yeah, well, I'm not saying they weren't well written. They just weren't, and it wasn't anything really new.
All right,
right? So I think it's interesting that he did reiterate when he starts talking about monetary policy in the remarks that they are meeting by meeting. So basically he's saying and reiterating that they're as data dependent as they can be. So if we wind up getting a slowing in the economy, a worse job market, and slower inflation over the next couple of months, then September is in play. And certainly the minutes made it sound like September is potentially in play. There's still a big risk of September, I think, just from an independent standpoint, because if the Fed goes in September, the narrative from those people who don't like the Fed is going to be, oh, they're trying to help the Democrats win the election, blah, blah, blah. So that's not something that Jay Powell will ever talk about or ever admit, but that has to be in the back of their minds at some level, is what are the knock-on political implications if we do this. Then again, if we see job losses in August, for example, then a cut would, they could easily make the case for a cut in September, but we're not there yet, right? Most of the data is slowing, but it's not slow, and that's something else Jay Powell mentioned in his remarks.
Yeah, I found that interesting, and I wonder if the balance is now shifting to worries about growth versus worried about inflation. Like, if you think of that as a barometer or like a scale, where do you think we are in that?
Well, I think that's right, but at the same time, the economy is a system. So slower growth usually begets slower inflation, right? And that's kind of what the Fed is hoping for. What they really just don't want is to fall into a recession. So the lines that you've heard from the Fed, almost every Fed speaker, and certainly the chair, and in today's remarks they'll say this again, is that they don't want to cut too soon because they're worried about a reacceleration of inflation, but they don't want to cut too late, right? So they're looking for this Goldilocks kind of scenario, and the trick is that they don't know ex ante, right? Because every move that they make in terms of cutting has to be meeting to meeting based on what the incoming data is, but it's not really the incoming data, it's more the extrapolation and the forecast then of what the next few data points are going to be and how bad the economy can get or how good the economy can stay. That's going to have to drive their policy decisions.
So, Ira, I mean, just looking at some of the red headlines for Bloomberg and Chairman Powell saying easing too little or too late could unduly weaken the economy. Where do you think the Fed is on that risk right here? Because there's a lot of folks, as you well know, that are saying we're actually past that point.
Well, it's interesting because there's a lot of people, including our own Bloomberg economics team, who are thinking that we actually are in the early throes of a recession. But a lot of the hard data doesn't show that. And actually, a lot of the investors that I speak with are saying just the opposite. They're worried that inflation is still too high. They look at the largest 8 stocks being some ridiculous valuation and metrics, and also note that spending in a lot of categories continues to be reasonably robust, even though there's definitely slowing in some sectors like durable goods.
So it's not obvious to me that that the Fed has to cut early. But at the same time, I do think that once they cut, their modus operandi is to continue to cut and not like skip a meeting or only cut twice and then wait. They're going to cut 4, 5, 6 times, then wait and see what's going to happen in the future. So I think they have this tricky balance that they're trying to run. I think ultimately they might not actually start cutting until November, but once they do, they'll cut faster than what the market's currently priced for, and that has some implications for, say, 2-year yields, which might fall further.
So, and you've been saying that for quite a while, and that's very different than, say, what the ECB is doing, which is cut and then wait and see what happens. We're currently waiting for Fed Chair Jay Powell to speak at the Senate Banking Committee. The ranking member, Senator Tim Scott, is speaking now. Then we'll get to his statement, Powell's statement, and then we'll get to the Q&A. Ira, on that point then, is a steepener then a de facto? It just matters if it's going to be more about the steepener, meaning that you're going to have a sell-off, or sorry, a lot of buying in the front end.
Yeah, I think, and that's ultimately coming, but it might not really start in earnest until the Fed actually starts the cut, because it's what's called a negative carry trade. So if you're a levered investor,
jargon alert.
If you buy 2-year notes and then you fund them via repo, that's negative 75 basis points right now, or thereabouts. So the problem is that holding on to that trade is very costly unless it's working. So I suspect that it will work, but it's a matter of when it will work, and that probably won't be until right at the time that the Fed actually starts to cut rates.
What are traders you're talking to? What are they saying, Ira? I mean, are they positioning themselves anyway at this point, or is it just too early?
Most investors that I speak with are like cautiously long, so they're cautiously long duration, and meaning that they will benefit when interest rates go down. So, which is one of the reasons why you still see the yield curve as inverted as it is. 2s, 10s being negative 35 basis points or so is just a signal that people are long that 10-year, 30-year part of the yield curve. And the reason for that is that they think that in a few years, interest rates are going to be lower than they are today. So, I have to buy now. And our forecast continues to be we're going to wind up seeing sub 4%, 3.8%-ish 10-year yield by the end of this year. So, and I think that unfortunately is becoming more of the consensus. So, I think we were reasonably early in that call, and now of course it's consensus, so we have to reevaluate. But I do expect, as time goes on, we will get a slower economy. The Fed will be cutting, and that means the entire yield curve will wind up seeing lower interest rates. But to Alex's point before, it's the 2-year where you're going to see probably the biggest the biggest yield move overall.
If you were a senator, as we all obviously wish to be, what would you ask Powell right now when your constituents are worried about inflation, et cetera? They're also worried about growth. Like, what would be the question you really want to have answered today?
Well, unfortunately, the question that a lot of people are going to ask, and certainly the one that I would probably ask, Jay Powell won't answer. He'll give a non-answer answer to it. But it's what does he think the relationship is? And what I'm very curious about is what does he think the relationship is today between interest rates and the economy? Because I think that has changed very significantly over the last 30 years. There's just a lot of structural differences in the economy today than it was in the 1980s or 90s, when monetary policy clearly had a pretty big effect on the economy, and that while the long and variable lags were kind of noticeable, right? They were about a year-ish, right? Plus or minus a few months. Today, though, those lags might be far longer and might actually be different. You listen to folks like Rick Reeder at BlackRock, and he's saying that, hey, high interest rates actually are supporting the economy as opposing to slow it. And I'm sympathetic to that, because when we look at the money markets and just how much cash flow is being thrown off by money market mutual funds today, and the extra, $6 trillion that are in that market right now, that is a non-trivial amount of money that people can either spend or makes them feel more wealthy, right? So the wealth effect is having an effect there too. So that's something that I think could be asked, and maybe something that Jay Powell needs to answer at future statements.
Is there consensus on the Fed here for interest rate policy? And if not, do I care?
The only consensus that I have is that they will lower interest rates at some point in the future. There is not as much consensus as to exactly when and how. Now, you can look at the economists' consensus forecast, which are saying September, but when you look at the market, the market actually is not convinced that there's 100% chance of a cut in the options market until December. So you're looking at, yes, lower interest rates. Timing is less important to me than the terminal rate. So what happens to, say, expectations for rates in 2025 and 2026? That's going to affect the Treasury market much more than if they start in September, November. That in reality, that doesn't matter to the 10-year as much as it would for, say, the 2-year, or if you're trading short-term interest rate futures.
Do you feel like the Fed has an idea of where the neutral rate is? I feel like they slough off a lot of the questions about r-star.
Yeah, well, ex ante, it's very difficult to really know where the neutral rate is. They have to have some semblance of an idea in their own framework as to, is r-star 2.5%, which is what they put in the dots for the long-term interest rate. But in reality, it's probably, some people I think on the Federal Open Market Committee think it's higher than that, right? It might be 3 or 3.5%, which makes their job slightly easier because. The risk is that if you're trying to stimulate the economy, you have to cut interest rates so you're below r-star, right? And so if r-star is 2.5%, then that means you have to cut to 1% or 2 or 1.5% to be stimulative. Whereas if r-star is, say, 3.5%, then you can cut to 2.5% and be stimulative. And I think that's the challenge that both the Fed has in trying to determine that. But again, like you don't know. And as I mentioned, our view, my view personally, is that the structure of the economy has shifted enough, and we haven't kind of gotten the academic literature and maybe some of the monetary policy framework in order to actually know how monetary policy, and r-star is just part of monetary policy, needs to be in order to have inflation stable and the economy in general growing at a slow but not overheated pace.
Ira, I'm looking at the 2-year Treasury. It's at 4.63%. We were at 5% just around April 30th. Isn't the market already doing the Fed's job here?
Ooh.
Yeah, in some ways it is, right? Because obviously the markets are trying to anticipate what the Fed's going to do. So that's why if let's say the Fed doesn't realize some of the cuts that are currently being priced, you wind up seeing a lot of volatility there, which is exactly what happened, right? Keep in mind, we've been in this very broad range for the 2-year, been as low as 4.3% and as high as I don't remember the exact high, but 5.52%, or 5.2%. So you're talking about almost 100 basis point trading range in the 2-year this year, and that's really based on the expectation for what the Fed's going to do, right? The Fed at one point was expected to cut interest rates 6 or more times this year, and then now we're back at 2, and we were at one point almost 0.
All right, very good. Ira Jersey, thank you so much. U.S. interest rate strategist for Bloomberg Intelligence. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. Special coverage. Fed Chairman Jay Powell addressing the Senate Banking Committee. Let's go to there right now.
Dual mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the benefit of the American people. Over the past 2 years, the economy has made considerable progress toward the Fed's 2% inflation goal, and labor market conditions have cooled while remaining strong. Reflecting these developments, the risks to achieving our employment and inflation goals are coming into better balance. I will review the current economic situation before turning to monetary policy. Recent indicators suggest that the U.S. economy continues to expand at a solid pace. Gross domestic product growth appears to have moderated in the first half of this year, following impressive strength in the second half of last year. Private domestic demand remains robust, however, with slower but still solid increases in consumer spending. We have also seen moderate growth in capital spending and a pickup in residential investment so far this year. Improving supply conditions have supported resilient demand and the strong performance of the U.S. economy over the past year. In the labor market, a broad set of indicators suggests that conditions have returned to about where they stood on the eve of the pandemic, strong but not overheated. The unemployment rate has moved higher, but was still low. Was still at a low level of 4.1% in June. Payroll gains averaged 222,000 per month in the first half of the year. Strong job creation over the past couple of years has been accompanied by an increase in the supply of workers, reflecting increases in labor force participation among individuals aged 25 to 54, so-called workers in their prime working years, and a strong pace of immigration. As a result, the jobs to workers gap is well down from its peak and now stands just a bit above its 2019 pre-pandemic level. Nominal wage growth has eased over the past year. The strong labor market has helped narrow long-standing disparities in employment and earnings across demographic groups. Inflation has eased notably over the past couple of years, but remains above the Federal Open Market Committee's longer-run goal of 2%. Total personal consumption expenditures prices rose 2.6% over the 12 months ending in May. Core PCE prices, which exclude the volatile food and energy categories, also increased 2.6%. After a lack of progress toward our 2% inflation objective in the early part of this year, the most recent monthly readings have shown modest further progress. Longer-term inflation expectations appear to remain well anchored, as reflected in a broad range of surveys of households, businesses, and forecasters, as well as measures from financial markets. Our monetary policy actions are guided by our dual mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people. In support of these goals, the committee has maintained the target range for the federal funds rate at 5.25% to 5.5% since last July, after having tightened the stance of monetary policy significantly over the previous year and a half. We've also continued to reduce our securities holdings. At our May meeting, we decided to slow the pace of balance sheet runoff starting in June, consistent with the plans released previously. A restrictive monetary policy stance is helping to bring demand and supply conditions into better balance and to put downward pressure on inflation. The committee has stated that we do not expect it will be appropriate to reduce the target range for the federal funds rate until we have gained greater confidence that inflation is moving sustainably toward 2%. Incoming data for the first quarter of this year did not support such greater confidence. The most recent inflation readings, however, have shown some modest further progress, and more good data would strengthen our confidence that inflation is moving sustainably toward 2%. We continue to make decisions meeting by meeting. We know that reducing policy restraint too soon or too much could stall or even reverse the progress that we've seen on inflation. At the same time, in light of the progress we've made both in lowering inflation and in cooling the labor market over the past 2 years, elevated inflation is not the only risk we face.